Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The scream from the radio. I've always been fascinated by radio waves. Growing up, I'd spend hours tinkering with old transmitters, tuning into frequencies that were often filled with static, but sometimes, just sometimes, they carried whispers of something unknown. It was in those moments that I felt a strange thrill, as if I were hearing voices from another world. But nothing could prepare me for what would happen that night. It was late when I stumbled upon it. The radio had been sitting there on the old workbench in my cluttered garage for weeks and used in gathering dust. I had been trying to fix it earlier in the day, but it had become an obsession, something I just couldn't let go. The signal that night was different. It wasn't static or distant chatter. It wasn't the usual talk radio or music from some faraway station. No, this was something much darker, much more chilling. At first, I thought it was a prank. Some kind of distortion or random noise. I turned the dial, shifting frequencies, but it was always there, haunting, insistent. I turned the volume up and froze. The voice that crackled through the speakers was desperate, barely audible at first. Help, please, help me. I leaned in closer, straining to make out the words. The voice was shaky, weak, but there was no mistaking the panic in it. It was a woman's voice, desperate and afraid. It sounded real. Far too real. Who is this? I shouted at the radio, half expecting it to be a joke. But the response came, faint and terrified. Don't come, they're here, they won't let me go. The words were disjointed, broken by sobs and gasps for breath. I sat there, heart pounding, staring at the radio, unsure of what to make of it. The frequency was unfamiliar, and the words, they didn't make sense. Who was this person? Why were they calling out like this, and why was it coming through on my radio? I checked the signal again, flipping through different channels, but the voice didn't fade. It stayed with me, lingering in the air like a shadow, a warning. I grabbed my notebook and started jotting down the frequency, the words I'd heard, the strange sense of dread that settled in my chest. Could it be a recording? Some kind of old broadcast? I couldn't explain it. But there was no way I was going to let it go. There was something important about this. Something I had to understand. I pulled my chair closer to the radio, determined to get more information. But as I did, I noticed something strange. The voice, once so clear, was now accompanied by a faint background noise. A low, growling hum that seemed to vibrate the walls of the room. It wasn't from the radio itself. It was something else, something near. I shook my head, telling myself I was just tired. But deep down, I knew that something wasn't right. The next words made my blood run cold. Please, you don't understand. They're coming for you, too. I froze. The hair on my neck stood up. Whoever was speaking seemed to know something I didn't. Something I wasn't ready to hear. I couldn't stop thinking about the voice. It haunted me, gnawed at the edges of my mind like a distant scream in the night. After the unsettling morning, I had no choice but to investigate. Who was this person? Why were they calling out through my radio? And more disturbingly, How did they know about me? I spent the next day digging through everything I could find. I contacted a few fellow radio enthusiasts, explaining the situation. Most of them dismissed it as interference or a signal anomaly, but one of them, an older man named Hank, was different. His voice, rough and weathered, dropped to a hushed tone as soon as I mentioned the frequency. That frequency, he said slowly. It's not in use anymore. Hasn't been for decades. I was taken aback. What do you mean? It's active right now. I just heard some on it. Hank paused, and I could almost hear the rustle of papers through the phone. That frequency was assigned to a broadcast station years ago. It was shut down after an incident. A terrible one. A woman went missing. It was all over the news for a while, but eventually, people forgot. The station was closed, and the frequency was left to die. I felt a chill creep up my spine. But the woman, what happened to her? There was a long silence before Hank spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. The police never found her. They said it was like she vanished off the face of the earth. Some say she was involved in something strange, something dark. Others think she was taken. Taken? I echoed, my voice shaky. Taken by what? Hank sighed, the weight of years of fear and uncertainty in his words. I don't know. I've heard stories, rumors about things lurking in the spaces between frequencies. People who hear voices that aren't supposed to be there. If you're hearing her, son, I don't think it's a coincidence. You've crossed into something you can't just walk away from. The line went dead. Hank had never sounded so scared, so defeated. I didn't know what to think. But one thing was clear, this wasn't just an odd radio malfunction. There was something far more sinister happening. And somehow, it was connected to me. I spent the rest of the evening researching the incident Hank mentioned. The more I dug, the stranger the details became. The woman's name was Emily Hart, a reporter who had worked at the station, known for her investigative work into paranormal phenomena. Her last broadcast had been a live interview with someone who claimed to have communicated with otherworldly entities that seemed to be able to manipulate the physical world. Emily had gone missing shortly after that broadcast. No one knew what happened to her, and the investigation had gone cold. The coincidence of the frequency and the woman's disappearance gnawed at me. But I couldn't stop. I had to know more. I had to find her. Later that night, I returned to my radio. It had become a strange obsession, a pull I couldn't resist. As I tuned into the same frequency, the familiar crackle of static filled the room. I held my breath, waiting. Then, the voice returned. Please, don't listen, they're already here. The voice was weaker now, strained, as though it was fading. But I could still hear the desperation in her words. I had to act fast. Whatever it was that was reaching through to me, I couldn't let it get any closer. Suddenly, the room around me seemed to grow colder, the air thick with an oppressive stillness. I turned off the radio, but the humming noise remained, low and vibrating, as though it was coming from the walls themselves. My breath hitched in my throat as I slowly rose from my chair. There was no mistaking it now. I wasn't alone. I stepped cautiously towards the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The faint, haunting echoes of the voice followed me, no longer coming from the radio but from somewhere deeper, somewhere closer. Please, you don't understand. They're coming for you. My hand shook as I reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The The door was locked, but not by me. Something, or someone, had locked it from the other side. I swallowed hard. The whisper grew louder, clearer, as if the voice was inside my head now, taking root in my thoughts. Help me. They won't stop. They won't stop until they have you, too. I backed away, my mind racing. What did this mean? Was Emily still out there? Was she trapped, just like I was, caught in some kind of signal loop, unable to escape? The humming from the walls intensified, now vibrating the floor beneath my feet. The room seemed to pulse with energy, as if the very air had become alive. I reached for my phone, desperate to call for help, but when I turned it on, the screen flickered, displaying only static, a distorted image of my own reflection. I was no longer in control. Whatever was happening, I was caught in it now. The static on my phone's screen distorted further, twisting and warping the reflection of my face. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, as if it, too, were becoming part of the strange rhythm pulsing through the room. The temperature had dropped so low that I could see my breath in the air. I backed away from the phone, my fingers trembling as I dropped it to the floor. The voice, Emily's voice, was now louder, almost frantic. It echoed in the walls, in the very air around me. I could feel it reverberating in my bones, dragging me deeper into the fear that had begun to take root. I couldn't think clearly. My mind raced in all directions, grasping for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. But there was nothing. No logical explanation. Only the growing sense of being trapped, like a fly in a spider's web, caught in the pull of something I couldn't understand. I grabbed the radio again, its cold metal sending a shock through my hands. The static had returned, thick and suffocating, and then, once again, that voice broke through. "You should have stopped," Emily whispered, her voice cracking. "They know you're here. They can feel you. You won't escape. Not like I did." I felt a wave of panic flood through me. What did she mean, not like I did? I didn't have time to process the meaning. I tried to speak, to call out to her, but no words came. It was as though something had clamped down on my throat, leaving me mute. The walls seemed to close in, the room stretching in a sickening, distorted way. It was as though the space itself was alive, bending and warping. I could hear the low hum, louder now, vibrating through the floor, the ceiling, everything. My surroundings felt like they were becoming unreal, slipping between dimensions. I could barely keep my balance as I staggered toward the door again. It was still locked, and this time I noticed something strange. The door didn't look the same. The wood was cracked, dark marks running along the edges, as though something had clawed at it from the other side. I pressed my ear against it, and the sounds from the walls intensified, as if they were coming directly from the space on the other side of the door, where the world itself seemed to be bleeding through. I stumbled back, horrified. My mind was screaming for me to act, to find a way out, but there was no way out. The room was shrinking, folding in on itself. I could hear the whispers of the voice becoming clearer, sharper. "They're coming. It's too late. You won't make it out." The room around me began to blur, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw shadows moving just out of the corner of my vision. Figures, or maybe just the remnants of them, faint and fleeting, like they were being pulled between worlds. I clutched the radio to my chest, the only thing that seemed real in this nightmarish space. Then, I heard something else. It wasn't Emily's voice this time. It was something deeper, something ancient. A growl. A noise so raw and guttural, it seemed to scrape against my very soul. The hum from the walls became a growl, vibrating like the earth itself was coming alive to swallow me whole. I turned toward the window. The outside world was black, the night pressing in on me like a suffocating blanket. The once calm street outside now felt distant, foreign, as though it didn't belong to this reality anymore. I could hear no sounds from the world beyond, no cars, no voices, just that deep, unsettling hum. My eyes darted back to the radio. I had to make it stop. I couldn't breathe. The shadows were closer now, flickering in the corners of the room. They were waiting, watching, waiting for something. I gripped the radio's dials with a renewed urgency, twisting them in every direction, but the signal didn't stop. It only intensified, the growl of static deepening. And then, between the crackles, I heard something that froze me in my tracks. A voice. Emily's voice. But this time, it wasn't a plea for help. It was a command. "Don't turn it off," she said, clear as day. "If you turn it off, you'll never leave. You'll be like me. Trapped." I was shaking. I tried to rationalize it, to push aside the overwhelming terror that was threatening to consume me. Maybe it was just a trick. Maybe the static was playing tricks on my mind, making me hear things. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever was on the other side of the radio, it was real. It had to be. I stumbled back from the radio, dropping it onto the floor with a sharp thud. The growl continued, and now I could feel something cold and suffocating, seeping into the air around me. The shadows were no longer just moving in the corners. They were moving in the room, their forms growing larger, more defined. I turned to look at the door again. It was no longer a simple door. It was warped, pulsing like the walls themselves. The marks were no longer just scratches. They were symbols I didn't understand, but their presence terrified me. There was no way out. I backed away, my breath coming in short, desperate gasps. The voice on the radio, Emily's voice, spoke again, but this time it was different. It was no longer warning me. It was laughing. A cold, hollow laugh that echoed in my head, twisting my thoughts. "You can't escape," Emily's voice said, low and mocking. "You never could." Then everything went silent. The room, the growl, the voice, everything stopped. I thought I was free for a moment, until I realized the silence wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. I couldn't move. The room felt smaller now, pressing on me, and I felt the coldest chill I had ever known creep down my spine. My heart pounded wildly in my chest, but I couldn't make myself move. And then, I heard it, the most terrifying thing I've ever heard. A whisper right behind me. Close enough that I could feel the breath against my neck. "You're not alone." The door behind me slammed open. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest as the door creaked open by itself. The darkness beyond it seemed to stretch, a void so thick I couldn't see anything past the doorway. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to go near it, but something in me, something primal, drove me toward it. I couldn't tell whether it was curiosity, fear, or the strange pull that had taken root in my soul. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air changed. It was colder, freezing, in fact, and heavy, thick with an oppressive weight. The humming from the walls had stopped, but the deep growl was still there, vibrating in my bones. The shadows shifted, moving unnaturally fast, flickering in and out like flashes of bad reception on an old TV. I took a step forward, my feet dragging like they were sinking into the floor. Each movement felt wrong. Nothing felt solid. It was as though the very ground beneath me was unstable, like walking on the surface of a body of water about to break apart. A soft whisper of Emily's voice, no, not Emily, something else, reached my ears, barely audible over the pounding in my skull. You shouldn't have come. The shadows twisted and lengthened in response, stretching up toward the ceiling. They no longer moved like fleeting shapes, but like living things, alive and hungry. The room began to change again. The walls stretched, the air became thick with a pungent, metallic smell, and I could feel my skin crawl. I couldn't tell where the room ended and the void beyond began. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. I could barely breathe, let alone form a thought. All I could hear was my own panic breathing and the gnawing, whispering, mocking voice that had once been Emily. I stumbled backward, my eyes wild. What are you? What do you want from me? The voice answered with a distorted laugh, the sound hollow and twisted. We want you, like we took her. A sharp pain lanced through my chest, a cold grip clutching my heart. My vision blurred, my knees buckling beneath me as the presence seemed to grow stronger, overwhelming me with its suffocating weight. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, the room froze. Everything was still. The growl had stopped. The shadows hung motionless in the corners. Even the air seemed to pause, holding its breath. I dared not move, afraid that the moment I did, I would be consumed. The silence was deafening, and it felt wrong. Like the world itself had stopped, but for a reason I couldn't understand. And then, I heard it again. A whisper, so faint, so far away, but somehow louder than all the chaos that had come before. Turn it off. The words froze me in place. It was Emily's voice, her voice, clear and urgent, but strained, as though she were speaking from beyond the veil of reality itself. I turned slowly, my eyes darting to the radio that was still on the floor where I had dropped it. The dial flickered on its own, crackling with static, as if calling me back to it, beckoning me toward the source of this nightmare. I couldn't breathe. My heart was hammering in my chest. I didn't know what to do. It felt like the room itself was closing in on me, the walls pressing tighter, the shadows reaching for me with long, inhuman fingers. I tried to run, tried to escape. But my feet wouldn't obey. They felt like lead, weighing me down as though the floor had become quicksand, pulling me further into the nightmare. The door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping me in this suffocating space. I couldn't get out. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't. The radio crackled once more. Turn it off, before they come. The voice was clearer now, more desperate. The static intensified as if the radio was feeding on the very air around me. I stumbled toward it, but each step felt heavier than the last. My limbs were growing weaker, my body refusing to move, the oppressive weight of the presence growing stronger with every passing second. I couldn't stop myself. I had to turn it off. It was the only way. My fingers brushed against the dial, and for a split second, everything seemed to pause, the world holding its breath. The static stopped. But it wasn't over. No, it was just the beginning. As soon as the sound cut out, I felt something shift. A cold, unnatural chill spread through the room, colder than before, colder than I had ever known. I heard a noise behind me, faint, almost imperceptible at first, but then growing louder. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing through the air. I turned around, my breath catching in my throat. They were here. Figures stepped out from the shadows, their forms shifting and contorting, their movements jerky and unnatural. They were like people, but not quite. Their bodies seemed to flicker, like they were made of static, caught between dimensions. Their eyes were black, empty, soulless, and they stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The air was thick with their presence, and the room felt like it was closing in even tighter. I had heard of ghosts, of spirits trapped in between worlds. But these were not spirits. These were something else entirely. Something worse. Something that had never been human. The radio crackled again, the voice, Emily's voice, whispering one final warning. You should have listened. And then, everything went dark. When I opened my eyes again, the room was empty. Silent. It was as if everything that had just happened, everything I had just witnessed, had never occurred. The shadows had receded, the oppressive weight lifted, and the air had returned to its stale, lifeless quality. But it was too quiet. The kind of quiet that made your skin itch and your heart race in your chest, unsure whether it was the calm before the storm or the aftermath of something far worse. I blinked, trying to focus, my mind still reeling from the events that had just unfolded. My body ached, my limbs stiff from the unnatural tension that had gripped me, but more than that, there was something else. A feeling that settled deep in my bones. A hollow, gnawing feeling that no amount of rational explanation could erase. The radio lay on the floor, exactly where I had left it. The dial flickered faintly, but there was no sound. No static. No voice. Only the faint hum of electricity. I stood slowly, the world still spinning around me as I took a cautious step toward the radio. My hand shook as I reached down to pick it up. It felt heavier than before, like it had absorbed some terrible weight, something I couldn't understand. I wanted to turn it off, but I couldn't bring myself to. There was a new, horrible sense of dread that coursed through me, a sense that if I touched it again, I wouldn't be able to turn it off. Then, the room shifted. The walls seemed to warp, bending slightly in and out of focus, like a distortion in reality itself. A low rumble began to echo from somewhere deep within the house, shaking the floor. Beneath me, the temperature plummeted once more, and I could see my breath in the freezing air. I staggered back, my hand gripping the radio tighter. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The world felt like it was crumbling, like everything I knew was unraveling at the edges. And then, the unmistakable sound of a voice, garbled and broken, coming from the radio. It wasn't Emily. It wasn't anything human. The voice was distorted, like it was being transmitted through a broken frequency, scrambled and incoherent. It was speaking to me, no, through me, its words barely intelligible, but full of malice and hunger. The voice was too deep, too wrong, and it vibrated in my chest as though it were inside me. Come closer. The words were like a physical blow. I wanted to scream, to throw the radio away, but my body refused to move. The sound grew louder, its power escalating, distorting further, filling the room with a deep, rumbling growl. The shadows in the corners of the room shifted again, pooling together like ink spilled on a canvas, moving toward me. I felt it, them closing in, tightening their grip. They were not just in the room with me. They were inside my head, in the very air I breathed. I could hear their thoughts, no, their intentions, pressing against my skull. I had to escape. I had to get out. I ran. I ran without thinking, without a plan. My feet pounded the floor, my heart racing in my chest, but no matter how fast I moved, it felt like the walls were closing in, like the house was shifting, turning, swallowing me whole. I reached the door, pulled it open, and the world outside wasn't there. Instead of the familiar street, the quiet suburban neighborhood, I saw a vast, endless void. A black, infinite expanse that stretched out beyond the horizon. It was like looking into the very fabric of the universe, seeing the raw emptiness beneath everything. I wanted to scream, but there was no sound. I stumbled back, the door slamming shut behind me, trapping me in the dark, distorted room again. And then, the radio crackled once more, louder this time. The voice was no longer garbled, no longer distorted. "You're one of us now." The words were clear. They were final. And then, everything went black. The silence was complete. The next morning, they found the house abandoned. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken windows, no clues as to what had happened. The radio was still there, sitting on the floor, its dial gently flickering, though no one dared to turn it on again. And somewhere, far beyond the reach of the living, a faint voice could still be heard on an old, forgotten frequency, calling for someone else. Lonely bicycle. It was a strange sight, and one that I would later wish I'd never seen. A bicycle leaning against a tree by the side of a quiet country road. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows that made the surroundings feel unusually still, as if time had slowed down just for that moment. I'd been driving home after a long day of work, the kind where your body feels drained but your mind is racing with endless thoughts. But as soon as my car slowed near that spot, something inside me shifted, and my attention was drawn straight to the abandoned bike. It wasn't an old, rusted thing. No, it looked almost new, shiny, with bright red paint that still reflected the sunlight. Its wheels were untouched by mud, and the seat was perfectly in place. It was just sitting there, alone, as if someone had simply set it down and walked away. But why? The road was not a popular one. Hardly anyone passed through here, except for the occasional traveler who took a shortcut. My eyes darted to the ground. No tire tracks, no signs of movement. It was as if the bike had appeared out of nowhere, and the more I stared at it, the more I felt the unease creep in. The silence around it felt thick, like something was waiting, something hidden, just beyond my line of sight. My thoughts raced as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe someone had broken down and left it there? Maybe it was just a case of someone leaving it behind to return for it later? But why wouldn't they have left a note, or at least a hint as to why it was left there? I turned my gaze back to the bike, my fingers tightening on the steering wheel. I felt the unease turn into an uncomfortable knot in my stomach. There was something off about it. Something wasn't right. I could almost hear the wind stirring the grass beside the road, a soft rustle that didn't seem to match the stillness around me. The sound made me glance over to the trees lining the road. Nothing there but shadows. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The thought flashed through my mind to stop and investigate further, to check for any clues that might explain the bike's presence. But as my car crawled past, I saw something else. A small, flickering red light attached to the frame of the bicycle. It was barely noticeable at first, blending in with the sunset. But as I looked closer, I realized it wasn't a reflection from the sun. It was a light, blinking at regular intervals. My heart skipped a beat. It could have been a simple bike light, but it felt so much more, deliberate, as though it was waiting for something. I felt the sudden urge to drive faster, to get away from whatever strange thing was unfolding before me. My foot pressed harder on the gas pedal, and I sped off into the fading light, leaving the lonely bicycle behind. But even as I drove, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. The bike, the strange light. I couldn't explain it, but a part of me was already certain that I had seen it for the last time. The next morning, the unease still clung to me like a heavy fog. I tried to convince myself that I had simply overreacted the night before. It was just a bicycle, after all. People leave things behind all the time. But the more I tried to push the thoughts out of my mind, the more vivid the image of that flickering light became. As I drove down the same road again, a knot twisted in my stomach. The road was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that made everything feel too still, like nature itself was holding its breath. I hadn't planned on coming this way again, but something in me urged me to see if the bike was still there. I tried to shake off the rising tension, convincing myself it was just curiosity. But as I neared the spot, I felt my grip on the steering wheel tighten. The trees, which had looked so ordinary yesterday, now seemed to loom closer, their dark branches stretching out like gnarled fingers. And there it was. The bicycle, exactly where it had been the night before, leaning against the same tree. But now, in the daylight, it looked even stranger. The once shiny frame had a layer of dust on it, as if it had been there for much longer than I had initially thought. The red light was still blinking, though now it seemed slower, almost deliberate. I stopped the car, my heart hammering in my chest. Why hadn't anyone come for it? I couldn't understand. The road was so isolated, there should have been no reason for anyone to leave something like this. I glanced around, expecting to see someone walking along the road or perhaps returning for their bike. But the only movement was the occasional flutter of leaves in the breeze. The silence felt suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. It was as if the world had paused, waiting. I forced myself to breathe, trying to calm the growing panic in my chest. My mind scrambled for an explanation, any explanation. Maybe someone had gone off into the woods, and they'd be back soon? Maybe the bike was left as a marker for someone to find? I tried to rationalize, but the longer I stood there, the more unnatural it all seemed. I noticed something else now. The area around the tree was different. There were no footprints in the dirt, no sign of movement at all. It was as if the bike had simply appeared in that spot overnight, without any human interaction. A shiver ran down my spine. Suddenly, the stillness was broken by a faint sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate. The sound of something moving. I tensed. It was coming from the woods, just beyond the tree line. I squinted into the shadows, trying to make sense of the noise. It wasn't the wind anymore. It was the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps. Someone was out there. But who? My mind raced. I had been alone on this road, and there was no reason for anyone to be here now. Not in the middle of the woods, not on this quiet stretch of highway. The footsteps grew louder, closer. My breath hitched to my throat. The anxiety that had been simmering within me reached its peak, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. The sense of being watched, of being followed, was overwhelming. I backed away from the car, my feet stumbling as I turned to leave. But just as I reached for the door, I froze. A voice, soft and distant, whispered through the air. "Come back." It was barely audible, but it was unmistakable. My heart raced in my chest as I turned toward the voice, but there was no one there. The woods were silent again. I quickly got back into the car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The footsteps had stopped, the silence returning with a heavy weight. I didn't wait another second. I slammed the car into drive and sped off, the image of that blinking light and the whispered voice haunting me as I left the road behind. But even as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still watching. For days after that encounter, I couldn't escape the unease that gripped me. It followed me everywhere, the feeling of being watched, the whispering voice that seemed to linger in the corners of my mind. I tried to tell myself that it was just stress, that the exhaustion from work had played tricks on me. But no matter how hard I tried to push the thoughts away, they kept returning with a gnawing persistence. The blinking light, the footsteps, the voice, it all felt too real, too vivid to dismiss as imagination. I tried to avoid the road, taking different routes to and from work. But it was as if the memory of that place had embedded itself into my mind. Each time I drove past the area, a chill ran down my spine, and I found myself glancing at the trees along the side of the road, half expecting to see something, or someone, lurking just beyond my view. It was only a week later, when I received an odd call, that everything would change. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, low and gravelly. "I heard you saw it," the voice said, and for a moment, my blood froze. I didn't respond, unsure if this was a prank or something more. "The bike," the voice continued. "The one on the road. You saw it, didn't you?" I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. How did they know? Had I said something to someone? No, I hadn't. I hadn't told anyone about the bike, about the strange things I'd experienced. "Who is this?" I managed to ask, my voice trembling. "I know you're scared," the voice said, "but you have to go back. You have to go back and see it again. It's the only way you'll understand. You can't escape it." I didn't know how to respond, but before I could say anything, the call abruptly ended, leaving me in stunned silence. The room around me felt heavy, like the air itself was thick with something I couldn't name. A terrible thought wormed its way into my mind. What if this wasn't some joke? What if the voice on the phone was real? What if whatever I had seen on that road was something more than I had been willing to believe? I couldn't shake the compulsion to return. I tried to tell myself that it was ridiculous, that I was letting my fear get the better of me. But the idea of going back, of facing whatever had been waiting there, became irresistible. The next day, I found myself driving down that same stretch of road again, despite every ounce of logic telling me not to. My grip on the steering wheel was tight, my eyes darting nervously to the side, half expecting the blinking light to reappear in the corner of my vision. As I approached the familiar spot, I saw it again. The bicycle, standing alone by the tree, as if it had never been moved. But this time, something was different. The air felt colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer, reaching out toward me. The stillness that once felt peaceful now felt oppressive, as though the very environment was holding its breath. I pulled the car over, heart pounding in my chest. The bike was exactly the same as it had been before, no sign of anyone around it, no footprints in the dirt. But something was undeniably wrong. The red light on the bike was now flashing in a rapid, erratic pattern, as if it were alive, calling out for attention. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise as I stepped out of the car. My breath came out in short bursts, the air freezing and sharp in my lungs. I walked toward the bike slowly, feeling my heart race with each step. The silence around me was suffocating. That's why I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the tree line, almost hidden in the shadows. It was too far away to make out clearly, but I could feel its presence, like a dark stain in the world around me. I froze, my body locking up in fear. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through the darkness. A cold chill washed over me, and my instincts screamed at me to run, to get back in the car and drive away as fast as I could. But my feet felt heavy, like they were glued to the earth. "Come closer," a voice whispered, barely audible, but it was unmistakable. The same gravelly voice from the phone. I shook my head, backing away slowly, but my body refused to move faster. My legs felt like they were made of stone, heavy and uncooperative. The figure in the shadows shifted, just slightly, as if it had noticed my hesitation. I didn't know if it was the fear, or something more, but a strange compulsion took over me. I found myself stepping toward the figure, drawn by an unseen force. With each step, the figure became clearer, more defined in the dim light. But as I drew closer, I realized that it wasn't a person at all. It was a shadow. A shape that stood unnaturally tall, with no clear form, only a dark outline that seemed to absorb the light around it. And then, as I reached out in a daze, it spoke again. "Now, you see." Before I could react, everything went black. The world around me swallowed up in total darkness, leaving me unable to move, unable to breathe. And then, I felt something cold, something icy, brush against my skin. The last thing I heard before everything went silent again was the sound of a bicycle was spinning, as if it had just started to move on its own. When I regained consciousness, I wasn't sure where I was. My vision swam in and out of focus, and the world around me felt wrong. The familiar surroundings of the road were gone. In their place was an expanse of shadowed emptiness, a space that stretched endlessly, suffocating and disorienting. I sat up, panic flooding my senses as I looked around. I was no longer standing on the side of a road, but in a cold, darkened void, a place where the air felt heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic. For a moment, I wondered if I was dreaming or if I had simply lost my mind. But the strange, sharp clarity of my thoughts told me otherwise. This wasn't a dream. This was real. Whatever had happened, whatever I had walked into, it was no illusion. The world around me was silent, unnervingly so. No sounds of nature, no wind rustling the trees, no distant hum of passing cars. Just a suffocating quiet that pressed in from all directions. I was standing in the middle of a long, narrow path, surrounded by tall, dark trees. But they weren't the trees I had seen before. They were twisted, gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. I took a step forward, my legs unsteady, and the ground beneath me felt strange, unnatural, as though I was walking on something that wasn't quite solid. My breath came in shallow gasps, my mind struggling to process what was happening. Where was I? What was this place? That's when I heard it. A low, grinding sound, faint but unmistakable, like the creak of old metal. It came from ahead, beyond the darkness. My heart skipped a beat as I turned toward the source of the noise. And then I saw it. The bicycle. It was standing upright in the middle of the path, exactly as it had been on the road, its red light blinking in rapid succession. But now, it wasn't just a bike. It was a beacon, an anchor in this twisted space, and the closer I drew to it, the more it seemed to pulse with an energy that felt both unnatural and ominous. The air grew colder, and I shivered involuntarily. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the frame of the bicycle. The metal was unnervingly cold, colder than it should have been. And for a moment, I felt a strange sensation, like the bike was alive, breathing beneath my touch. Suddenly, the voice came again, but this time it wasn't from the shadows. It was as if the words were being whispered directly into my mind. "You're here now." I recoiled, my heart racing. I didn't want to be here. I didn't want to hear this. The voice continued, this time colder, more insistent. "You've seen it. You've come for it. Now, you'll understand." I stumbled back, my mind racing to make sense of it all. What was happening? Why had I been pulled here? And more importantly, how could I escape? The air shifted again, and suddenly, the ground beneath me began to tremble. I felt the vibrations in my bones, a deep, resonating hum that sent a chill through my entire body. The trees around me shook, their branches groaning under some unseen force, and I could feel a pressure in the air that made it hard to breathe. I tried to move, to run, but the path ahead seemed endless. Each step I took, the darkness seemed to stretch further and further, pulling me deeper into its grasp. The bicycle remained at the center of it all, like some terrible anchor, its light blinking faster now, faster than I could comprehend. And then, the shadows began to move. At first, it was subtle, a flicker at the edge of my vision. But then, more shadows emerged from the darkness, shifting, flowing, their forms twisting into shapes I couldn't make sense of. There were no faces, no clear features, just dark, formless figures that seemed to move in and out of existence. I heard footsteps again, only now, they weren't in the distance. They were all around me, closing in, moving with purpose. I tried to scream, but no sound came. The air was too thick, too heavy, to let anything escape my lips. The figures were getting closer, and I could feel their presence, like a suffocating weight pressing in from every side. They moved faster now, converging on me, but never quite touching me. Their forms flickered in and out of existence, and with each flicker, I felt my fear growing. I turned back to the bicycle, the only thing in this strange, twisted place that seemed familiar. It was the only thing I had left to hold on to. But then, the light on the bike stopped blinking. The entire area fell into a profound silence, an eerie calm that made my skin crawl. The air grew colder still, and a shadow appeared in front of me, blocking the path. This shadow was different. It wasn't just an indistinct blur in the darkness, it had shape, a form that was too clear, too sharp, as if it had been waiting for me all along. It took a step toward me, and with it, the ground beneath me seemed to shift, pulling me in. I couldn't move, couldn't run. My legs wouldn't respond. The shadow loomed closer, and as it did, I felt the pull of something deeper, something more ancient. "Welcome," the voice said again, this time not in my mind, but from the figure itself. It was deep, hollow, as if the sound came from somewhere far below the earth. "You've finally arrived." And then, before I could even scream, I felt myself being dragged into the darkness, swallowed whole by the very space I had stepped into. The last thing I saw was the bicycle, its red light flickering once more. And then, nothing. When I opened my eyes again, I was back on the road. The familiar stretch of highway seemed unchanged, as though nothing had ever happened. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm orange glow over everything. The world was calm, peaceful, even serene. But something felt off. The air was still too thick with a strange weight, as though it wasn't quite real. The road, the trees, the light, all of it felt like a dream, a memory that was both mine and not mine. I blinked, trying to clear the fog from my mind, but the same image persisted, the bicycle. It was there, once again, leaning against the tree by the side of the road. The red light was blinking, just as it had before, but now it felt like a signal, a warning, not a simple flash of a broken light. I froze. How was this possible? Hadn't I just? My mind struggled to make sense of what was happening. Was I dreaming? Was I stuck in some sort of loop? But there was no time to think, no time to question. The bicycle was there, waiting, and I couldn't bring myself to ignore it any longer. Slowly, I stepped out of the car, my legs stiff and uncooperative, as if they didn't belong to me. The road around me felt like it was stretching out, twisting, folding in on itself. My thoughts scattered in all directions, unable to latch onto any coherent idea. I approached the bicycle, each step feeling like it took longer than the last, as if time itself was stretching out. The closer I got to it, the more I felt the pull, an invisible force urging me forward. I reached out a hand, touching the cold metal of the frame once more. The moment my fingers made contact, the world around me seemed to shift. The ground trembled, and the shadows of the trees stretched longer, their gnarled branches twisting like fingers reaching for me. And then, I heard it. A voice. Low, distant, but clear. You shouldn't have come back. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, but there was no one there. The road was empty, the trees still swaying in the wind. But the voice, it was in my head, in my very bones, vibrating through every part of me. It felt like a warning, but from whom? Or from what? The air grew colder again, the stillness suffocating. I turned back to the bike, unable to look away, as though something was forcing me to focus on it. Suddenly, the red light began to flash faster, almost frantically, and the voice spoke again, louder this time. Do you understand now? I stumbled back, my mind reeling, unable to comprehend what was happening. The bike, this cursed object, seemed to be alive, its presence overwhelming, consuming. The shadows around me began to shift again, the air thickening with an oppressive weight. And then, the trees themselves began to move. Not swaying in the wind as they should, but creeping forward, twisting their trunks like serpents, blocking my path. I looked around, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The world was closing in on me. Everything felt wrong, nothing was where it should be, and the only constant, the only thing that stayed the same, was the bicycle. The voice spoke once more, now a whisper, as if it were inside my very mind. You are part of it now. You always have been. The words didn't make sense, but they gnawed at me, digging into my soul, twisting around my thoughts. I felt a cold, gnawing sensation in the pit of my stomach. My body felt heavy, disconnected, as though I were no longer in control of it. Suddenly, everything around me darkened. The trees, the road, the sky, they all faded into an endless void, a blackness so complete that it swallowed every shred of light. The shadows that had once been distant now closed in around me, and I could feel them crawling under my skin. The bicycle was gone. The road was gone. I was alone in the darkness, suspended in an empty, formless place. The voice, now deeper, more distorted, echoed through the void. You've seen it. You've touched it. Now you will never leave. I tried to scream, to fight, but there was no sound, no movement. My body was paralyzed, trapped in this eternal, oppressive silence. The realization hit me with the force of a crashing wave. This wasn't just a place. This wasn't just a dream. This was a cycle, a never-ending loop of despair, of isolation. I had stepped into something I could never escape, something that would keep me tethered to this darkness forever. And somewhere, deep in the void, I could feel it, watching, waiting, just like the bicycle had. The thing that had been there all along, in the shadows, in the silence. It was always there. And now, it had me. Shadow behind the window. It started quietly. At first, I thought it was just the darkness playing tricks on me. The long, cold nights alone in the apartment had begun to wear me down, and every creak of the floorboards or gust of wind against the windows felt more ominous than it should have. But then I noticed it. Every time I turned off the lights at night, a shadow appeared outside my window. It wasn't there while I was awake, only after I switched off the lamp beside my bed and the room was drowned in darkness. At first, it was just a fleeting silhouette, something that looked like a figure standing just beyond the glass, maybe a tree or a stray shadow from passing cars. But the more I watched, the more details started to emerge, and I realized this wasn't a trick of the light. The figure outside was too still, too solid, and, most unsettling of all, it never moved. I told myself it was probably a neighbor, someone walking by. It was a quiet street, and sometimes late-night pedestrians wandered down the road. But even when I stood up to look closer, I couldn't make out anything definitive, just the shadow. It was like a shape, darker than the night itself, barely visible against the dim glow from the street lamp outside. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. I wasn't sure if I wanted to believe it. The first few nights, I convinced myself it was nothing more than my tired eyes playing tricks. But soon, the pattern became undeniable. Every time I turned off the light to go to bed, I could feel it, this presence. And with each passing night, the shadow grew clearer. It started to take on more definition, shifting into something that resembled a figure, standing unnaturally still. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled with unease. But I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the tree outside had cast a different shadow, or the light from the street lamp had somehow made it appear more lifelike. But none of that explained the feeling that I wasn't alone. That something, or someone, was watching me. I started closing the curtains when I went to bed. I couldn't bear the thought of seeing the dark shape again. But even with the curtains drawn, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching. I'd wake up in the middle of the night sometimes, drenched in sweat, feeling like I was being suffocated by the very air around me. Every creak in the floorboards, every rustle in the darkness, felt like the shadow was moving closer. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. But the shadow, it wasn't just in my mind. It was real. The whispers started a few nights after I'd first noticed the figure. At first, they were so faint that I thought I was just imagining them, soft murmurs, like a distant conversation. But they would always stop the moment I turned on the light. The whispers were always there, just beyond the veil of darkness, like something trying to make itself known. The air around me would grow colder each time, and I would feel a pressure building in my chest, as though something was drawing closer. When I turned the light back on, the whispers would cease, and the shadow would vanish. But every time I shut off the light again, it would return. And I could feel it, closer than before. Closer, and waiting. I couldn't escape it. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Could it be a trick of the wind? A shadow cast by a moving branch outside? I didn't believe it, but I had to hold on to something, anything, that could explain away the feeling of dread that settled in my bones each night. But then, one evening, something happened that I couldn't ignore. I'd been avoiding sleep, unable to bear the thought of what waited for me when the lights went out. But exhaustion finally won out, and I sank into bed, too tired to close the curtains, too tired to care. As I turned off the light, I noticed the shadow again. It was there, just outside the window, but this time it was different. It was clearer, sharper, more solid than before. The shape of a person, tall and unmoving, standing just out of view. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at it, unable to look away. And then it moved. It shifted ever so slightly, as though it was adjusting its position, and the hair on my neck stood on end. I jumped out of bed, grabbing my phone, trying to gather the courage to check outside. But before I could move, a whisper rose from the shadows. "Don't look." It wasn't a voice I recognized, but I felt it in my bones, deep and hollow, like the voice of something that had been waiting for a very long time. The whisper seemed to come from all around me, and I froze, unable to move, unable to speak. "Don't look," it repeated. I took a deep breath and turned the light back on. The shadow was gone. But the feeling, it lingered. For the first time, I didn't feel relieved. I felt more alone than ever, as if something unseen was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake, to give into the darkness. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound, any movement. The whispering had stopped, but the presence, it was still there, lurking at the edges of my mind. The shadow would return, I was sure of it. It always did. I hadn't slept a wink that night. My mind replayed the whisper, the warning, over and over again. "Don't look." It felt like a command, a rule that I wasn't supposed to break. But what would happen if I did? What did that shadow want from me? I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was getting closer. I had always thought that shadows were just the absence of light, simple things that existed because of obstruction. But now, standing by the window and staring out into the dark, I realized that I had no idea what a shadow truly was. What if it wasn't just a reflection of something outside? What if it was something alive, something waiting? By morning, the sun was up, and the shadows retreated, as they always did. I tried to convince myself that it had been nothing more than an overactive imagination, a trick of the mind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just in my head. I went about my day as usual, trying to push the thought of the shadow from my mind, but it was impossible. Every time I looked out the window, my eyes would scan the darkness, searching for that shape. I started to notice more things I hadn't before, the way the streetlights flickered, how the wind would rustle the trees in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. Was it my mind playing tricks on me, or was there something else? Something watching? That night, I told myself I wouldn't look. I wouldn't give in to the temptation to check. I would leave the lights on and let myself sleep, no matter how tired I was. But the moment I turned off the light to settle into bed, my eyes instinctively darted to the window. There it was. The shadow, standing just outside my window. But this time, it was different. It was closer. The shape of it seemed more distinct. There were no longer the hazy edges that once made it look like a trick of the light. It was solid, almost tangible. A dark, formless figure that seemed to pulse with a presence all its own. I felt my breath catch in my throat. My body froze. I could hear nothing except the pounding of my own heartbeat, but I could feel something else, something more, a thickening of the air, a pressure building in the room. The whisper came again, low and rasping from somewhere beyond the window, though I couldn't pinpoint where. "Come closer," it said. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my feet wouldn't move. My eyes were locked on that figure, my body paralyzed with a fear I couldn't understand. "Come closer," the voice repeated. I felt a shiver run down my spine. My legs felt heavy, unwilling to move, but the voice seemed to pull me toward the window, urging me to do something I didn't want to do. I tried to convince myself it was all just a dream, but everything felt too real. The pressure in the air, the cold creeping under my skin, it all felt physical. As if the shadow itself were reaching through the walls, through the glass, trying to grab hold of me. With every ounce of willpower I had left, I pushed myself to look away, to force my eyes off the window and back to the room around me. The shadow remained just beyond the glass, unmoving and silent. I kept my gaze fixed on the walls, my breath shallow and quick, praying the nightmare would end. But then it shifted. It wasn't the shadow itself that moved, it was something else. Something within the room. I felt it. Something behind me. A presence that wasn't there before. The hairs on my neck stood on end, and I slowly turned my head. And there, standing at the foot of my bed, was a figure. It was the same shadow, but this time it was inside the room. It had crossed the threshold, moved beyond the window, and now it was standing inches from me. The outline of it was blurry, shifting like smoke, but it was unmistakably there, tall, formless, and looming. Its edges rippled as if it didn't belong to this world. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. The voice, no longer a whisper, but a deep, guttural murmur, came from the shadow. "You shouldn't have looked." And then, before I could even react, it reached out toward me. The air around me grew colder, the temperature dropping to an unbearable chill. The figure's shape became clearer, its form sharp and defined, but the more I looked at it, the more I felt myself slipping away. My heart raced, but the more it reached, the more it felt like the room was closing in on me, like the walls were pressing down, suffocating me. "Don't look again," the voice said, but this time it wasn't a warning. It was a command. I wanted to run. I wanted to escape, but my body refused to listen. I was trapped. Trapped in the room, trapped in the shadow, trapped by my own fear. With one last desperate effort, I reached out for the light switch beside my bed, my fingers trembling as I finally made contact. I flicked the switch, and the room exploded with brightness. But when I opened my eyes, the figure was gone. The shadow was gone. I lay there in the sudden silence, gasping for air, trying to convince myself it was over. But I couldn't escape the feeling that it was still there, waiting, just beyond the edge of my sight. The room felt too quiet, too still. It was as if the darkness had never really left. I tried to convince myself I was safe now, but the whispers in my mind told me otherwise. The following days were a blur. I tried to go on with my routine, but every step felt like I was carrying the weight of that shadow with me. It had followed me into my waking life, its presence never fully gone. Every time I walked past a window, every time I switched off a light, the feeling crept back into my chest. I couldn't shake the image of that thing, its shifting, flickering form that had reached into my world from somewhere else. I told myself it was over. I had turned on the lights. The shadow had vanished. But deep inside, I knew better. The moment you acknowledge something like that, it doesn't just leave. It lingers, waits for you to slip, waits for you to forget. I tried to avoid the dark as much as I could, keeping lights on whenever I was home. But even that didn't feel like enough. It was like the darkness had grown closer. The night air felt thicker, oppressive, like it was closing in around me. The walls seemed smaller. The rooms quieter. And every time I looked at the window, I felt my heart skip. The worst part wasn't the shadow itself. It was the way it made me doubt everything I thought I knew. I started questioning reality. Was the figure really there? Was it some figment of my imagination? Or had something happened to me that I couldn't explain? The whisper. The cold. The way it had reached toward me, as if it were some force I couldn't escape, even when I had the light on. One night, the unease was so overwhelming that I decided I couldn't just sit there waiting for it to come back. I would confront it, face it head on. I would figure out what it wanted. I would end this once and for all. With trembling hands, I pulled open the blinds to the window. I stood there in the dark, staring out into the empty street, half expecting the shadow to appear again, just like before. The air felt like it was holding its breath, and my skin crawled with the anticipation of something, anything, happening. Minutes passed. Nothing. I waited longer, my pulse thudding in my ears. The silence stretched on, deeper than it should have been. It felt wrong. The longer I stood there, the more it felt like something was being drawn to the window from the other side, something waiting in the dark. I turned away from the window and slowly back toward my bed, my mind racing. I had to stay calm. I had to think logically. There had to be a reason for all of this. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone was playing with me. But who would go to such lengths? Who would stand outside my window for hours, night after night, without ever being seen? I grabbed my phone, my fingers shaking as I typed a quick message to my friend, asking if they'd noticed anything strange in the neighborhood. But even as I typed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That presence I had felt before, the one that had lurked in the corners of the room, watching, waiting, was here again. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I could feel it. It was inside the room now. Suddenly, there was a sound. A soft scraping, like something dragging across the floorboards. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, eyes wide, my breath caught in my throat. I reached for the light switch, but my hand was frozen halfway. The shadow. It was here. The scraping grew louder, more distinct, as if whatever it was slowly moving across the floor toward me. It felt like the room itself was shifting, like the walls were bending inward, closing in on me. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, a shadow that darted across the floor, too quick to follow. But then it stopped. It was there. In the corner of the room, standing against the wall, barely visible. A shape, darker than the rest of the dark, its edges undulating like smoke. But I could see its eyes, 2 points of blackness that seemed to pierce right through me. The cold radiated from it, the same biting chill that had followed me before. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure stood motionless, staring at me with those empty, unblinking eyes. "Don't look," it whispered again, its voice low and guttural, like it was speaking from the depths of the earth itself. The words weren't a warning anymore, they were an order. But this time, I couldn't resist. I couldn't stop myself. I looked, and the moment I did, the room shifted again. The walls seemed to stretch, growing taller, farther apart. I could feel the pressure building in my chest, pushing me down into the floor, as if the very air around me had turned solid. The shadow was no longer just a shape in the corner. It was inside me. I felt it in my bones, crawling through my veins, twisting its way through my mind. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. It had me. It had my soul. The figure took a step forward, its shadow stretching across the room. It reached out a hand, fingers thin and long, like the branches of a dead tree, and touched my face. Cold seeped into my skin, down into my bones. It was not just a touch, it was an invasion. It was the feeling of something slipping beneath my skin, taking hold of everything I was. I wanted to fight it, to break free, but I couldn't. The last thing I remember before the lights flickered out was that whisper, closer now, almost a growl. You shouldn't have looked. And then, there was nothing. Only darkness. I woke up to an unfamiliar stillness. There was no sound, no wind, no distant hum of traffic, not even the faint rustle of the trees outside. It was as if the world had stopped entirely, suspended in some frozen moment where nothing existed except the hollow emptiness around me. I didn't know how long I had been unconscious. I blinked slowly, trying to focus, but the room felt wrong, too quiet, too dark. My heart pounded in my chest, and I tried to sit up, but my limbs felt heavy, like they were made of lead. The air smelled stale, almost sickly, like something had been rotting here for a long time. Panic crept into my chest. I reached for the light switch, desperate for the comfort of brightness. But my hand found only cold emptiness where it should have been. My body trembled, and a creeping sense of dread began to gnaw at the edges of my mind. I had to get out. I had to escape. I forced myself to stand, my legs unsteady beneath me. As I stumbled toward the window, I felt an unsettling pressure, like something was pushing down on my shoulders, weighing me down, preventing me from moving freely. I reached for the blinds, but when my fingers touched the fabric, I froze. The window. It wasn't right. I tugged at the blinds, but they wouldn't move. I could feel them, taut against the frame, as if something was holding them in place from the other side. I pressed my face against the glass, desperate to see outside, but all I saw was darkness. The streetlights, the familiar view of my neighborhood, everything was gone. The night outside stretched on endlessly, like a void that swallowed everything in its path. And then, I heard it again. The scraping sound. It was faint at first, like the distant scratching of nails on wood, but it grew louder, closer. It was coming from inside the room. I turned around quickly, my heart hammering in my chest. There was nothing there. But I could feel it. The presence. It was all around me. I was no longer alone. I backed away from the window, my pulse racing. My thoughts were a blur, disjointed, as if my mind was struggling to keep up with what was happening. What was this place? Was it even real? The walls, which had once felt like home, now seemed alien, strange. The floor beneath me felt uneven, shifting with each step, as if the room itself was moving. The scraping sound grew louder, more frantic. I spun in circles, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but it was everywhere. The air grew colder, heavier, pressing down on me. I could hear breathing. It wasn't mine. I stopped, frozen in place. The sound was so close now, I could feel it against my skin, warm and damp, like something was standing just behind me, breathing into my ear. I turned slowly, my eyes darting around the room, but there was nothing there. It was then that I saw it. In the far corner of the room, a shape began to form. At first, it was just a blur, a distortion in the air, as if something was shifting in and out of focus. But then it became clearer. A figure. Tall, shadowy, and formless. It was the same one from before. The thing that had haunted my every thought. It was there, just beyond my reach, its outline shimmering in and out of existence, like a half-remembered dream. But this time, it wasn't just a shadow. It was something more. The air thickened, swirling with a cold, suffocating fog that made it hard to breathe. I could hear it, soft whispers, voices coming from the figure, too low for me to understand, but the tone was unmistakable. It was mocking, taunting, like it was aware of my every fear, my every doubt. I took a step back, and the room seemed to stretch away from me, the walls moving farther and farther, like they were pulling away into the distance. I couldn't tell if I was still standing in the same place or if I had been pulled into another reality altogether. I felt a pull, a deep tug in my chest, as if something was calling me, drawing me toward that shape. "Why are you doing this?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond at first. It simply stood there, watching me with its empty, soulless gaze. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. And then it spoke. The voice, deep and hollow, reverberated through the room like an echo of something ancient. "Because you looked," it said, its voice like 1,000 voices layered on top of each other. "And now, there is no going back." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but I couldn't. The fear had paralyzed me. My body was no longer my own. It felt as if the room itself had become a trap, closing in on me from all sides, suffocating me, draining me of all will to fight. The figure began to move, its form shifting and warping with every step. It was closing the distance between us, its presence overwhelming. And then, as it stepped closer, I saw it. The thing that made my blood run cold. In its hands, it held something small, something fragile. A mirror. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The mirror shimmered in its hands, and in the reflection, I saw myself standing there, terrified, wide-eyed. But as I stared into it, I saw something else. Behind me, in the reflection, was a figure. A shape. It was me. But it wasn't. It was something darker, something wrong. And then the reflection in the mirror smiled. I couldn't breathe. The room spun, and the pressure around me tightened. I wanted to scream, to run, but all I could do was stare into the mirror, unable to tear my eyes away from the thing staring back at me. And then, everything went dark. I woke up in the same room, but something was different. The air felt stale, thick with the weight of something I couldn't name. My heart pounded, and the oppressive feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, almost as if it didn't belong to me. Every inch of my skin tingled with the sensation of something crawling beneath it. My thoughts were fragmented, memories slipping through my mind like water, never quite landing where they should. The silence was deafening. It wrapped around me like a blanket, and for a moment, I could have sworn I was trapped in some sort of dream, one I couldn't wake from. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper than before, curling and twisting in ways that defied logic. I closed my eyes, but that only made it worse. The darkness I had been avoiding for days was no longer just outside my window, it was inside my mind, seeping into my very thoughts. I could feel it crawling through me, filling me with dread. The whispers returned, faint at first, but growing louder and clearer with each passing second. They were in my head now, not just around me, but inside. "Why are you still here?" One of the voices crooned, its tone smooth, coaxing, like the voice of an old friend. I wanted to block it out. I wanted to scream, to break free, but I couldn't. The voices had taken root in my mind, twisting everything I had once known into something unrecognizable. The light above me flickered, and in that brief moment of illumination, I saw the mirror again, just like in the reflection. It was lying on the floor, cracked, shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. But even as I looked at it, I knew that the mirror wasn't the only thing that had shattered. Something deep inside me had broken, too. I reached out toward it, trembling, unsure of what I was trying to find. I didn't want to face it, but something in me urged me forward, as if the pieces of glass held the answers to everything that had been happening. As my fingers brushed the sharp edges of the broken mirror, a sudden wave of cold swept over me. I gasped for air, my lungs seizing. The room began to tilt, spinning faster and faster. I couldn't stop it. I saw myself. No, it wasn't me. It was the thing I had seen in the mirror. The shadow. The reflection. It grinned at me, the smile widening impossibly, its eyes hollow pits of darkness. You should have never looked, it whispered. The sound of it was everywhere, inside me, around me, suffocating me. And then, I realized with a sickening jolt, I was the shadow. It had always been me. The dark thing that had haunted me was not some separate entity. It had been me all along, waiting to emerge, waiting for the moment I finally broke. I could feel it in my chest, in my mind. A part of me, the part that had been locked away, buried deep, was now fully awake. And it wasn't content to simply watch from the shadows anymore. It was taking control. I tried to scream, but the sound was choked off, lost in the overwhelming darkness that had swallowed me whole. My reflection in the mirror didn't move with me. It stayed frozen, locked in place, still smiling that same wide, empty grin. No escape, the voice said, now layered with my own voice, echoing in my skull. You looked, and now you are mine. The room spun faster, the walls bending inward, collapsing. My own thoughts turned against me. My vision blurred, and I could no longer tell where the shadows ended and I began. And then, everything was silent. When I woke again, I was outside, standing in the middle of the street. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting pale light across the empty road. My body ached, but there was no trace of the fear that had gripped me before. No whispers. No cold. Nothing. For a long time, I just stood there, staring at the sky, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had it all been a nightmare? A figment of my imagination? But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The shadows weren't gone. They had simply shifted. I could still feel them, tugging at the edges of my mind, reminding me that they were waiting for me to look again. But I didn't want to look anymore. I couldn't. As I walked back toward my house, I passed the familiar windows. The curtains were drawn. The door was locked. Everything was exactly as it had been before. But I knew it wasn't the same. Something had changed. I had changed. I could feel it. The shadow was inside me now, waiting, watching. And this time, it didn't need the darkness to exist. Whispers in the dark. I had been driving for hours, the monotonous hum of the engine lulling me into a daze. The road stretched endlessly before me, framed by dark, looming trees on either side. It was one of those late-night drives where everything feels like it's moving in slow motion, the world outside blurred into shadows and dim lights. It was peaceful, in a way, but there was something about the isolation that made me uneasy. I had taken this route before, many times, but tonight, something felt different. The air outside the car was thick, almost oppressive, as if the very atmosphere was charged with something I couldn't quite place. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but the endless road ahead and the occasional flicker of a passing sign or distant street lamp. There was no other car in sight. I had been on this stretch of road countless times, driving from one small town to another, but tonight it felt as if the world had closed in around me. I pulled over to the side of the road, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. Maybe I was just tired. A quick break would clear my head. I stepped out of the car, feeling the cool night air bite at my skin. The only sound was the soft rustling of leaves in the trees and the faint hum of the engine idling behind me. As I stood there, stretching my legs, I noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet. No insects. No distant animal calls. Just the sound of my breath and the slight whine of the car's engine. It was then I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible at first, carried by the wind. I froze, my body stiffening. My mind raced. Was it just the wind? Help, the whisper murmured, so faint I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. My heart skipped a beat. I scanned the area, my eyes darting between the trees, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of life. Just the oppressive stillness. Another whisper. Please. I took a cautious step toward the sound, my pulse quickening. Was someone out there? A voice, faint and trembling, seemed to be coming from the woods just beyond the roadside. I squinted, trying to make out any shape in the darkness. Nothing. Just the shadows. I turned back to the car, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe I was just hearing things. After all, it had been a long day, and the isolation of the road was starting to get to me. I wasn't going to find anything out there. But then, as I reached for the door handle, I froze again. A feeling washed over me, cold and unshakable, as if someone was standing just behind me. I didn't turn around immediately, but I felt them. I could sense them, as if their presence was pressing against my back. The air felt suddenly heavier, the quiet too oppressive. That's when I heard it again. Help me. I turned around quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound had come from just behind me, and yet there was no one there. The trees loomed silently, casting long, twisted shadows in the dim light. The whispering voice seemed to be coming from the very darkness itself. It was so faint, but so insistent. I could feel my breath hitching in my chest, panic starting to creep in. What was happening? My eyes darted around the road, but there was no movement. No figure stepping out from the trees, no sign of anyone lurking in the shadows. It was as though the whisper had come from nowhere, or perhaps from everywhere. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the feeling of dread that had settled over me. My thoughts raced as I stumbled back toward the car, the gravel crunching underfoot. The whispering had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse, unnatural. The night seemed to stretch on forever, heavy and oppressive. I forced myself to open the door and slide into the driver's seat. The soft hum of the engine felt strangely comforting. I gripped the steering wheel, trying to steady my nerves, but something kept gnawing at the back of my mind. I had been alone on this road 1,000 times before, but now everything felt wrong. I took a deep breath and started the engine, pushing the car back onto the road. My eyes scanned the dark landscape outside the window as I drove, trying to focus on anything that might distract me. The trees, the road signs, the distant flicker of a light from a farmhouse far off in the distance, anything that would help calm my racing thoughts. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The quiet, the emptiness, everything around me felt more like a trap than a road. And then, as I drove past a bend in the road, something caught my eye. I glanced to the side, my stomach lurching as I saw it. A handprint, smudged and smeared against the side window of the car. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt as I jerked the wheel to the side. My heart was hammering in my chest as I stared at the handprint in disbelief. How could it be there? I had been outside only moments ago, and the car had been completely empty. There was no one around, no one who could have touched the glass. Yet, there it was, a handprint, clearly visible in the dim light, the fingers outstretched, the palm flat against the glass. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My first instinct was to wipe it off, but as I reached for the window, I hesitated. Something about it didn't feel right. It wasn't just the fact that the handprint had appeared out of nowhere, it was the way it seemed to stay there. Like it was waiting. I took a breath, my hands trembling. I forced myself to look closer, leaning in to examine the handprint. It was faint, as if the person who had left it had pressed their hand lightly against the glass, but the details were unnervingly clear. The skin around the edges was slightly blurred, almost as if it were feeding into the window itself. A chill crawled up my spine. It wasn't just a handprint. It was an imprint of something that didn't belong. Suddenly, the air inside the car felt thick. The engine idled in the silence, and once again, I was overcome by that sense of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. "Help me," the whisper returned, this time clearer, closer, as though it was inside the car with me. I jerked back in my seat, my breath catching in my throat. The whisper wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, a presence pressing against me. It was as if the air around me had become heavy, thick with the weight of whatever it was that had left that handprint. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but the road behind me was empty, the night just as silent as it had been when I'd first pulled over. There was no sign of anyone, no movement in the darkness. I wiped my forehead with the back of my hand, my mind scrambling for an explanation. My eyes darted from the handprint to the dark woods around me. Could it be some sort of prank? A trick of the mind, some strange coincidence? Maybe I was just imagining the whole thing. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. I had to leave. I shoved the car into gear and hit the gas, the tires spinning slightly as the car lurched forward. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't help but glance back at the side mirror, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. But there was nothing. Just the darkness, the trees, and the road stretching endlessly ahead. Yet, as I sped down the road, I could still hear the whisper. And I knew it wasn't going to let me go. The car seemed to crawl through the darkness, no matter how much I pressed on the accelerator. The night was thick, like a heavy blanket wrapped around the road, muffling every sound. I tried to steady my breathing, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was following me. The whisper had faded for now, but the memory of it clung to me, lingering in my mind like an echo that wouldn't stop reverberating. "Help me," it repeated in my head over and over. I wanted to scream, to shout at it to leave me alone, but I knew that would only make it worse. I had to keep moving. I had to get away. The headlights illuminated the endless stretch of road, the familiar landmarks now unfamiliar and oppressive. Every turn seemed to lead me deeper into some unseen trap, and the more I drove, the more the sense of isolation pressed in on me. I was alone, utterly alone, with no one to turn to, no one to help. I tried to focus, to think rationally. It was just a handprint, right? Some sort of strange, unexplained phenomenon. Maybe the fog, the cold air, the isolation, all of it had played tricks on my mind. I could have left the car unlocked, or maybe someone had slipped by while I was outside, but I couldn't remember hearing anything. I hadn't seen anyone. There was no explanation. But even as I tried to convince myself, something deep inside me refused to listen. The whisper had been too real. The handprint had been too real. And now, there was a part of me that was starting to wonder if I was even alone on this road at all. I drove faster, my eyes scanning the road ahead, trying to keep my mind focused on the asphalt, on the miles ticking by beneath the tires. But every now and then, my gaze would drift to the side mirror, and I would see nothing but the empty stretch of road behind me. Nothing. I told myself. But the feeling never went away. Then, just as I was about to reach a sharp curve, I saw something in the distance. A figure standing on the side of the road. I slammed on the brakes, heart racing, the car jerking to a stop as the figure came into clearer view. It was a woman, standing motionless, staring directly at me. Her face was obscured by the long, dark hair that hung over her face, but even from this distance, I could see the faint outlines of her features. She was wearing a simple dress, her hands hanging limp at her sides, the fabric blowing in the wind. I should have driven away. I should have kept going, but my curiosity and the fear that gripped me kept me frozen in place. I rolled down the window, just a crack, and called out to her. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She didn't respond. She just stood there, motionless, as if she hadn't heard me. I leaned forward in my seat, my eyes narrowing. "Hello?" I called again, but my voice sounded strange, almost too loud in the quiet night. There was no response. Then, in one swift motion, she lifted her hand, pressing it flat against the side of the car. My heart nearly stopped. The same handprint. It was there, on the glass, just like before. The same smear, the same faint imprint of fingers. I gasped, slamming the window shut, my mind spiraling into panic. My foot slammed on the accelerator, and I tore away from the figure, not daring to look back. The car roared down the road, and yet the feeling of her presence clung to me like a shadow. I glanced at the side mirror, expecting to see her, but she was gone. Gone, like she had never been there. I kept driving, faster now, barely able to breathe as the road seemed to stretch endlessly before me. I wanted to leave, to escape, but deep down, I knew I wasn't going to be able to outrun this. Something had followed me. It wasn't just some trick of the mind or some lonely traveler looking for help. The whisper had returned, this time louder, clearer, right in my ear. "Help me. Help me, please." And just like that, the world outside the car seemed to close in on me. The trees, the road, the night, it was all too much. I had to get away, but I wasn't sure where to go. There was no place left to run. The handprint on the window. The whisper. The woman. It was all connected. I knew it now. And as the car sped down the road, the world around me began to fade. The trees and the lights blurred together, becoming a twisted, chaotic mess until I could no longer tell where I was. The only thing I could hear was the whispering. Louder. More urgent. Help me, please. And then, with a sickening jolt, the car jerked to a stop. The lights flickered. The engine died. Everything went dark. The whispering stopped. And I knew, in that moment, that I wasn't alone anymore. I sat in the silence, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, but my mind was racing. The car had come to a complete stop, as if something had just yanked it from the road, as though I wasn't meant to drive any further. The engine sputtered, its last breath leaving it a final, guttural sound before everything was still. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here. Not in this quiet, suffocating blackness. My heart thudded in my chest like it was trying to escape, each beat ringing in my ears louder than the last. The whisper had stopped, but I could still feel it in the air, pressing against me, waiting. I fumbled with the door handle, my fingers slick with sweat, and yanked it open. The chill of the night hit me like a slap, sharp and biting. The world outside the car was suffocatingly dark, and for a moment, I wondered if I had somehow fallen off the map. There were no streetlights here. No signs. No houses. Just the endless stretch of the road and the oppressive weight of the night hanging over me. I stepped out, feeling the crunch of gravel beneath my boots. The air was still, as if even the wind was afraid to move. Then, I heard it again. A sound, just barely there, drifting from somewhere behind me. The faintest of whispers, so soft I wasn't sure if it was real or just my mind playing tricks. I turned quickly, scanning the darkness, but I saw nothing. Nothing but the road. And then, I noticed movement in the distance, near the trees on the side of the road. It was subtle, but it was there. Something, or someone. I couldn't tell. The figure was small, hunched, almost crawling, but it wasn't human. The way it moved was unnatural, too jerky, too fast, like it was crawling on all fours but only moving in strange, disjointed bursts. My breath caught in my throat. It was close. Too close. I took a step back toward the car, my eyes glued to the figure, but something stopped me. A sound. A noise. A tapping on the window. I froze. The window on the passenger side had fogged over, and I could see the faintest outline of a handprint on it. Not the one from before. This one was different, clearer, with the fingers stretched wide, as though it had been pressed forcefully against the glass. It was as if the thing outside the car was already inside. My heart hammered in my chest, and before I could react, I heard the voice again. This time, it was louder, more desperate. A whisper, but it felt like it was inside my head. Help me. I spun around, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The figure was closer now, a shape that seemed to glide through the darkness, getting nearer with each heartbeat. I couldn't run. I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed with fear. Then, in a sudden burst of panic, I sprinted toward the car, flinging the door open with a force that almost broke the handle. I slammed it shut behind me, my fingers fumbling to start the engine, but the car didn't respond. The whispers were growing louder now, as if they were inside the vehicle with me, pressing in on all sides. I could feel them. I could hear them. They were everywhere. The hairs on my neck stood up, a cold, creeping sensation crawling up my spine. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, the car started. The engine roared to life, the headlights flashing on, cutting through the darkness. I slammed the gas pedal to the floor, and the car lurched forward, speeding down the road, leaving the figure and the whispers behind me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. Something had gotten in. The road stretched out before me, endless and empty. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles were white, and my eyes flicked between the rearview mirror and the road ahead. The whispering was gone. The silence was almost deafening now. But I knew it wasn't over. It couldn't be. It wasn't just the car. It wasn't just the road. I wasn't alone. A shadow passed over the road. A figure. A shape. I didn't dare look back. But I couldn't help myself. I glanced in the rearview mirror. And for a split second, I saw it. The handprint. But it wasn't on the window. It was on the rearview mirror itself. A long, bloody streak smeared across the glass. I screamed, swerving the car violently to the side, my hands fumbling to regain control. And then, the world spun. The road became a blur. The darkness pressed in on all sides. I had made a mistake. A terrible mistake. The whispers were back. Louder this time. More urgent. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. My vision blurred, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. And then, there was nothing. I woke up to the sound of the engine idling, the car eerily still. My heart was still racing, but it was no longer pounding in my chest. It had slowed, almost to a stop, like the life had drained from me. I sat there in the car, disoriented, staring at the empty road ahead. There was no sign of the figure, no whispering, no handprints. The night felt strangely still. But something was wrong. I could feel it. Something had changed. The temperature in the car had dropped, and I could see my breath misting in the air. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, and this time there was nothing. No blood. No streaks. No handprint. But I still felt it. The presence. The thing that had been following me, the thing that had been with me since the beginning. It was here. I turned the key in the ignition, trying to restart the car. The engine sputtered, but it didn't turn over. It didn't matter. Because I knew the truth now. The road had no end. There was no way out. And as I sat there, staring into the abyss, I realized that I wasn't just driving on a road. I was driving in circles. The air inside the car grew colder, the darkness outside more oppressive. My hands were frozen to the steering wheel, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My thoughts were a blur, spinning in frantic circles, but one truth had settled deep within me. I was stuck. The road never ended. I had driven for what felt like hours, maybe days, maybe weeks, but it was always the same. The same empty stretch of pavement, the same lonely trees on the side of the road, the same black sky that never turned to daylight. The whispers had stopped, but their presence lingered in the corners of my mind. Their silence was more terrifying than any sound. I could feel them watching, waiting. The road had swallowed me whole, and now there was no way out. No escape. I turned the key again, the engine sputtering in protest, but it refused to start. The car was dead. It had been for a while now, but I hadn't dared admit it until now. The headlights were off. The interior lights flickered weakly before dying completely, leaving me in darkness. I should have gotten out. I should have run while I had the chance. But something kept me here, bound to this place, to this car. I wasn't alone. I knew that now. I could feel it, something inside the car with me, something just out of sight, watching, waiting for me to make the next move. I tried the door, but it wouldn't open. The handle was cold and unyielding, as if the car itself had become a prison. I banged on the window, desperate to break free, but the glass didn't crack. It felt like the car had become part of the road itself, as if it had fused with the darkness, trapping me here for good. I leaned back in the seat, my head spinning, trying to piece together the fragments of my thoughts. The handprints, the whispers, the shadow. None of it made sense, but it didn't need to. I wasn't dealing with logic anymore. I was dealing with something else, something older, something that had always been there, just beyond the veil of the world I thought I knew. A voice, barely a whisper, stirred in the back of my mind. You should have listened. It was a warning, but it was too late for that now. The road stretched endlessly before me, a black void that never relented. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A flicker of movement. A figure. The same one I had seen in my peripheral vision, always just outside of reach. Now, it was closer. Almost at the edge of the car, its presence palpable, like a shadow that bled into the very fabric of reality. The figure stood at the edge of the road, its shape distorted, stretching, twisting in ways that defied logic. It was not human. It wasn't anything that belonged in this world. But it was here, in front of me, waiting. I couldn't look away. My eyes were glued to it, even as my mind screamed at me to run, to get out, to escape. But there was nowhere to go. The figure took a step forward, and with each movement, the darkness seemed to grow deeper, more oppressive, swallowing the light. The sound of its footsteps echoed in the empty space, and I could feel the car shaking, vibrating under the weight of its presence. I pressed my hand against the cold window, watching as the figure came closer. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. Disappeared into the night, leaving only the echo of its footsteps behind. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But that feeling didn't last. The air in the car grew heavier, thicker, until it was suffocating. I could hear my own breath, shallow and ragged, but there was no escape. And then, a soft tap on the window. I turned slowly, my heart leaping into my throat, and looked at the glass. There, pressed against the window, was a handprint. Not the one I had seen before. A new one. Fresh. Clear. The fingers were splayed wide, as if someone, had been watching me from just outside the car. I gasped, my mind racing. This time, I wasn't sure if it was real or if I was losing my grip on reality. The whispers began again, louder now, more urgent, filling my mind, my body, my soul. I could hear them inside me, scratching at the edges of my thoughts. Help me, the voice whispered again, but it wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from inside the car, from somewhere behind me. I turned around, my breath catching in my throat. The back seat was empty. But there was something there. Something in the space just behind me, something that I could feel but not see. It was waiting for me to acknowledge it. I reached for the door handle again, my hand shaking, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked. I was trapped, and the thing that had been following me was closer than ever. In the reflection of the rearview mirror, I saw it. A face. Hollow eyes, mouth stretched in a grin that wasn't human. It wasn't a person. It was never a person. And as the darkness closed in, I understood one thing: there was no escaping this road. There was no way out. The whispers had always been a warning. I was never meant to leave. The field of tracks. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a warm orange glow over the fields. I was driving down a dirt road that stretched for miles, surrounded by vast acres of corn. The air smelled sweet with the scent of earth and summer. I always loved driving out here. It was peaceful, serene, with nothing but the rustle of the crops and the occasional bird call to break the silence. But that day, something felt wrong. I had been working at the farm for years, but I'd never seen anything like this before. When I pulled up to the edge of the field, I noticed something strange in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, some kind of optical illusion. But the closer I got, the clearer it became. In the middle of the field, a large, perfect geometric shape had formed in the corn. It was impossible to miss, a massive, symmetrical pattern, as if something or someone had pressed it into the stalks. The design was intricate, but it was undeniable. Something had left those marks. I felt a chill run through me as I stepped out of the car, the warm air now feeling colder against my skin. I approached the edge of the field cautiously, my boots crunching against the dirt beneath me. The shape in the corn was unlike anything I had ever seen. It looked like a massive crop circle, but the lines were sharper, more precise, like someone had carefully etched them with a ruler. There were no signs of machinery, no footprints, nothing to explain how this had appeared. I reached for my phone, but as I lifted it, I realized something even stranger: the camera wasn't working. The screen was black, no matter how many times I tried to unlock it or restart the app. It felt as though the phone itself had shut down. I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. Who would have done this? And why? The more I looked at the marks in the field, the more unsettling they became. It was almost as if the crop circle was staring back at me. Trying to push down my growing sense of panic, I walked along the edge of the formation, looking for any clues. There were no tire tracks, no footprints, not a single sign that anyone had been near the corn. The wind had picked up, but the corn didn't move. It remained still, as if it was frozen in time. I made my way back to the car, and that's when I saw it. A shadow. For a moment, I thought it was just the trees moving in the wind, but no, this shadow was moving, too. It was faint at first, but as I turned to look, it became clearer. Something, or someone, was standing at the far end of the field, just beyond the crop circle. I could barely make out a figure, dark and indistinct, as if it was just an extension of the growing darkness itself. I quickly got back into my car, heart pounding. I locked the doors and started the engine. But just as I began to pull away, something caught my eye, a flash of movement in the rearview mirror. There, at the edge of the field, something had changed. The crop circle, it was gone. The massive, geometric pattern had disappeared, leaving only flattened corn. It was as if the field had returned to its normal state, as if nothing had ever happened. I couldn't explain it. I should have driven away, but I didn't. Instead, I stopped the car. Something was pulling me back, something I couldn't ignore. I turned the car around and headed back down the dirt road, back toward the field. As I neared the spot where the crop circle had been, I saw something else, fresh marks in the dirt, leading from the edge of the field toward the road. The tracks were large, almost unnatural in their symmetry. The soil was disturbed, like something heavy had walked across it, leaving behind deep impressions. They weren't human, and they weren't animal. They were different, too large, too deliberate. The tracks led straight toward the entrance to the farm. And they didn't stop there. I followed the tracks, unable to tear my eyes away. They led to the old barn at the far end of the property. I had never seen anyone around the barn for years. It was abandoned. But now, those tracks were leading right toward it, as if something was waiting for me. I parked the car and got out, my heart racing. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but the air was thick, suffocating. The once familiar sounds of the farm were gone, replaced by eerie silence. No birds. No wind. Just the soft, uneven crunch of the tracks beneath my boots. I stepped toward the barn, my eyes scanning the area for any sign of life. The tracks continued toward the wooden door of the barn, and as I approached, I heard something. A faint sound, almost like whispering, coming from within. It was impossible to make out the words, but I could feel them resonating in my bones. I reached for the door, my hand trembling as I turned the handle. The barn was pitch black inside. No lights. No movement. Just the whispering, growing louder now, surrounding me. I took a step inside, my breath shallow, every nerve on edge. The tracks inside the barn were even clearer, deep indentations in the dirt, leading toward the farthest corner of the space. The whispers seemed to be coming from there, from the darkest part of the barn, where the light couldn't reach. Then, without warning, a loud creak echoed through the barn. I spun around, heart pounding, to see the door swinging shut behind me. I was trapped. And that's when I saw it. A figure, pale and gaunt, standing at the far end of the barn. It had no face, just dark, hollow eyes. And in its hand, it held something. A symbol, carved into wood, a shape I recognized from the crop circle. A perfect, geometrically intricate design. The figure began to move toward me, the whispers growing louder, turning into an unearthly chant. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping me in the dark. The last thing I remember was the whispers, filling my mind, my vision, as the figure closed the distance between us. And then, nothing. I don't know how much time passed. I couldn't tell if it was seconds, minutes, or hours. But I woke up, lying on the cold, hard ground of the barn, my head pounding, my limbs stiff. The air felt heavier now, thick with the weight of something that I couldn't understand. My chest tightened with every breath. The barn was silent. No whispers. No footsteps. Just the faint sound of wind outside, rustling the corn. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs unsteady. My head swam as I looked around, trying to make sense of everything. The tracks. The figure. The whispers. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination? I stood up slowly, wiping my hands against my jeans. The barn seemed empty. No sign of the figure, no evidence of what had just happened. But something felt wrong, like a presence was still there, lurking just beyond my sight. I moved toward the door, but as I reached for the handle, I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I noticed something on the floor. A handprint. It wasn't just any handprint. It was smeared, as though someone, or something, had placed its hand there with force. The imprint was dark, almost like it had been burned into the wood. I stepped closer, my eyes wide with dread, trying to make sense of it. And then I heard it. A low creaking sound, followed by the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on the dry dirt. I spun around, heart racing. There, in the doorway, stood the figure again. Its face was still a void, empty, black eyes staring directly at me. And in its hand, that symbol again. The same intricate geometric shape, carved into the wood, now glowing faintly in the dim light. My pulse pounded in my ears as I backed away, but the figure advanced slowly, its steps unnervingly quiet. The air around it seemed to warp, like the very space was bending under its presence. I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then, as the figure closed the gap between us, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Behind it, in the darkness of the barn, I could see shapes, other figures, more of them, emerging from the shadows. They were all holding the same symbol. They were all walking toward me. Panic surged through me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My eyes darted around, desperate for an escape, but the barn was closing in. The figures were all around me now, their presence suffocating, their hollow eyes watching. The whispers returned, louder now, a chorus of voices chanting in a language I couldn't understand. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, the earth trembling. The figures moved closer, surrounding me, the air thick with their presence. I couldn't escape. I knew I couldn't escape. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the symbol, carved into the wood of the barn, glowing brighter than ever. And then, there was nothing. I woke up again, but this time, I was outside. The air was cold, and the cornfield stretched out before me. The sky was dark, the stars twinkling faintly above. I was lying on the ground, my body bruised and aching. I struggled to sit up, my mind foggy. What had just happened? I looked around, my eyes darting to the edge of the field. The tracks were still there. The perfect, symmetrical lines in the corn leading from the barn to the center of the field. They were the same as before, and they seemed to stretch on forever. I stood up, trembling, and turned to face the field. And then, my heart stopped. In the distance, just at the edge of the corn, I saw them. Figures. Dark, indistinct shapes, standing still in the moonlight. They were watching me. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't respond. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figures. They didn't move. They just stared, their hollow eyes fixed on me. And then, one by one, they began to move toward me. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I ran. I stumbled through the cornfield, the stalks whipping past me, my breath ragged, my heart pounding in my chest. The figures were closing in, their footsteps silent, their presence growing heavier with each passing second. I ran until my legs gave out. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, but when I looked up, they were there. Standing around me. Silent. Watching. And then, I realized there was no escape. There never had been. I felt the coldness of their presence surrounding me, their eyes drilling into my soul. The whispers filled my mind, growing louder, merging into one voice. It was a voice that I knew. A voice I couldn't forget. And that's when I understood. I had always been a part of this. I had always been marked. I was just another track in their field. I woke up, gasping for breath. The air was thick, almost suffocating, as if I were drowning in it. My head felt like it was spinning, and my body was aching all over. I blinked, trying to clear the fog from my mind, but the world around me remained unclear, distorted. It was like I was trapped in a dream that I couldn't wake up from. Where was I? I tried to move, but my limbs felt too heavy, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I slowly turned my head, but there was nothing. No figures. No dark shapes. Just the endless expanse of the cornfield around me. The stalks stood still in the moonlight, silent and unmoving. Was it over? I wiped my face with shaking hands, trying to steady myself. The ground beneath me was soft, uneven. I was lying on the dirt road at the edge of the field, the distant hum of an engine breaking the eerie silence. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Too normal. But then I heard it. A low, faint whisper, almost like the wind. I stood up abruptly, my heart racing in my chest. I scanned the area, my breath catching as the whisper grew louder, clearer. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice. A voice that felt like it was crawling beneath my skin, whispering words I couldn't understand, but somehow I knew they weren't meant for me to hear. They were meant to be heard by someone or something else. I turned toward the field, my eyes darting from one side to the other. But there was no movement. No figures. Just the quiet rustling of corn in the breeze. I staggered back, breathing heavily. The sensation of being watched, the presence I had felt before, was gone. But the whisper remained, lingering like a phantom in my mind. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like lead. I was paralyzed by the weight of the situation, unable to fully comprehend what was happening. Had I imagined it all? The tracks? The figures? The whispers? It was hard to tell what was real and what wasn't. My mind was fractured, torn between the need to escape and the sense that I was being drawn deeper into something I couldn't control. I glanced back toward the road. The car, the one that had brought me to this cursed place, was parked just up ahead. The headlights flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the dirt. But then, as if responding to the whisper in the air, something caught my eye. A movement in the distance, just beyond the cornfield. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as I stared, the shape became clearer. A figure. Tall. Dark. Unmistakable. And it was moving toward me. I froze, unable to tear my gaze away from it. The whispers became louder now, clearer, as though they were coming from the figure itself. I felt my blood run cold. It was the same one. The one I had seen before. The one who had been haunting the barn. I tried to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't respond. I was rooted to the spot, my body betraying me. The figure kept getting closer, its presence suffocating, its eyes dark and empty. The closer it came, the more I could feel it. The more I could sense it in the pit of my stomach. It was all too real. Too real to ignore. And then, before I knew what was happening, the figure reached out to me, its hand cold as death, and I was pulled into the darkness once again. The last thing I felt before everything went black was the ground beneath me shifting, as if it were alive. And then I was swallowed whole. I don't know how much time had passed before I woke up again. This time, I was lying in the middle of the field, the moon above me casting an eerie glow over everything. The corn stood tall, untouched, but there was something different about it now. Something darker. I sat up slowly, my body aching from the pull of something I couldn't explain. There was no sign of the figure. No sign of anything. Just silence. But the silence was broken by something far worse than noise. A presence. I could feel it. It was still there, lingering. Watching me. The whispers were gone now, but they had left something in their wake. A feeling of wrongness, of being trapped in a never-ending nightmare. I stood up, my head spinning. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay in this field. I began walking, moving as quickly as I could through the rows of corn, my mind racing. I needed to get away. I needed to find someone. Anyone. But as I moved, something caught my eye. The tracks. The same tracks I had seen before. The same geometric shapes woven into the corn like a map. But this time, they were different. The shapes were larger, more complex, and they stretched across the entire field. It was as though they were calling me. I moved closer to the tracks, my heart pounding. I couldn't stop myself. I couldn't fight the pull. And then, I saw it. At the very center of the tracks. A figure. Dark. Hollow. The same figure from before. And it was standing right there, waiting for me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. My legs wouldn't move. I had no escape. The figure slowly reached out, and with it, the darkness closed in. And then, everything went black. Photographs of the missing. I'd never given much thought to old cameras. They were relics of a past era, dusty things that sat on shelves gathering more dust. But when my aunt passed away, I inherited one of these relics, a vintage film camera with a few rolls of film tucked inside it. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured I'd leave it sitting on the shelf like I had with all the others, a mere keepsake, a reminder of someone who had lived a quiet, uneventful life. But something kept pulling me back to it. Maybe it was the oddity of finding an old camera among my aunt's things, or maybe it was the sheer mystery of it, the rolls of film that had never been developed, left there as though they held some secret waiting to be uncovered. I couldn't resist. I decided to develop the film. I took the rolls to the local photo lab, and the technician there gave me an odd look when I handed them over. There was something strange in his eyes, something I couldn't place. But I thought nothing of it. After all, old cameras and rolls of film weren't that uncommon, were they? The next day, the photographs were ready. The moment I picked them up, I felt a chill run through me. They were unlike anything I expected. At first, the photos seemed normal. Just random snapshots of ordinary things, trees, landscapes, old buildings. But as I went through the stack, I began to notice something. In every photo, there were people. Some of them were alone, some in groups, but there was something haunting about their faces. Their expressions were blank, almost lifeless. It was as though they were trapped in time, unable to move or speak. I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that these people weren't just ordinary strangers, they seemed familiar, yet distant. But the real shock came when I turned over the last photo. There, in the center of the frame, was a picture of a man standing on a quiet street. He looked vaguely familiar. His face was stern, his eyes shadowed under the brim of a worn-out hat. But what struck me the most were the words written on the back of the photograph. Missing. April 12, 1995. My breath caught in my throat. The man in the photo was someone I recognized. His face had been in the news many times. He was one of the most well-known missing persons cases in our town, a man who had disappeared without a trace nearly 20 years ago. There was even a plaque dedicated to him in the local park, marking the spot where he was last seen. But how was it possible that he was in this photo, as though he had never left? Confused, I flipped through the rest of the photographs, my heart pounding in my chest. One by one, I found more faces I recognized, people who had vanished over the years. A young woman, missing since 2003. A child, disappeared without a trace just a year ago. Each photo was marked with the same chilling inscription on the back, missing. I could feel a tightness in my chest, an undeniable dread creeping in. The photos were old, some of them faded and worn, but they were all real, weren't they? These were people who had disappeared, people whose disappearances had been reported on the news, people who were still lost. The next logical question hit me like a hammer. How were they in these photos? Who had taken them? I picked up the phone and dialed the number of the local authorities. As the phone rang, I felt a creeping suspicion crawl up my spine. Was this some sick joke? Or was something much more sinister at play? When I finally spoke to someone, I explained what I had found. The missing persons, the photos, the eerie connections. The officer on the other end didn't say much at first, but when I mentioned the name of the man in the photo, the one missing since 1995, there was a long silence. "Wait there," the officer said, voice suddenly serious. "Don't touch those photos. We'll send someone over to take a look." I didn't argue. I put the phone down and waited, my thoughts racing. Every time I tried to make sense of what was happening, the more questions appeared. How could these people be in the photographs? Why had my aunt kept them? And who else knew about these photos? When the doorbell rang an hour later, I barely heard it. My mind was still reeling, caught in a whirlwind of confusion and fear. I opened the door to find two officers standing on the porch. One was tall, his face stern, and the other was a younger man, his expression unsure. The older officer stepped forward, holding a folder in his hand. "May we see the photographs?" he asked, his voice calm but with a hint of urgency. I handed them over without a word, watching closely as they flipped through each one, their faces growing increasingly grim. The young officer looked at the older one, then back at me. "You say these are from your aunt's camera?" the older officer asked. I nodded, still unable to speak. My throat was dry, my thoughts jumbled. "Your aunt." The officer trailed off, as though searching for the right words. "She was involved in something we've been investigating for years. I don't know how much you know, but she was a part of something much bigger than you can imagine." I didn't respond. I just watched as they exchanged a look that confirmed my worst fears. My aunt had been hiding something. Something dark, something tied to these missing people. And now, I was involved. What had she found? Why had she kept the camera? And who was watching now? I didn't know, but I was about to find out. The officers didn't leave immediately. Instead, they stood in my living room, exchanging quiet words that I couldn't quite make out. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. Every breath I took seemed heavier than the last, every heartbeat too loud in my chest. I tried to speak, to ask questions, but the words wouldn't come. The unease that had settled in me deepened with every passing second. What was going on? What had my aunt been involved in? Finally, the older officer turned to me. His face was set in grim lines, and there was a heaviness in his eyes that made me feel small, insignificant, like a child who had accidentally stumbled into a place they didn't belong. "You don't understand yet," he said, his voice low. "But you will soon enough. I'm sorry we have to drag you into this, but you've seen something you weren't meant to see." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. I was still trying to process the fact that the people in the photos were real and missing for years. The younger officer stepped forward, holding the stack of photographs carefully, as though they were something fragile, something dangerous. He glanced at the older officer before speaking. "We need to take these with us," he said, "for our investigation." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My hands were shaking as I handed them over, and the officer's fingers brushed mine as he took them. The cold touch sent a jolt of panic through me. "We'll be in touch," the older officer said, his tone final. "Don't try to find out anything more. It's too dangerous." As they left, I stood in the doorway, watching them drive away, a sense of dread lingering in the air long after their car disappeared down the street. I felt like I was on the edge of something I couldn't see yet but could feel getting closer. I went back to the table, staring at the empty space where the photos had been. My mind was still racing, trying to make sense of everything. My aunt, the camera, the people in the photos, the missing persons. But there was one thing that kept nagging at me. The officer had said that I wasn't meant to see these photographs. That meant someone didn't want me to know the truth. But why? Why now? I reached for the photo of the man from 1995, the one that had started all this. I still couldn't shake the feeling that I knew him, that his face was more than just a passing memory. But I couldn't place it. I turned the photo over again, and my stomach lurched when I saw something new. The words "missing." April 12th, 1995 were still there, but now, in small, cramped handwriting beneath it, was another phrase: "She's coming for you, too." I froze, my blood turning cold. Who had written that? And what did it mean? The room felt smaller, suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside seemed amplified in my mind, like it was all part of something bigger, something closing in around me. I had to know more. I had to find out what had happened to my aunt, what she had been involved in. The officers had said not to investigate further, but that only made me want to dive deeper into this mystery. The danger wasn't enough to stop me. I had to understand, had to see where this path led. I grabbed my phone and dialed the number I knew by heart. The number I had always called when I needed answers, my aunt's old friend, a man she had known for years. If anyone knew what she had been involved in, it would be him. The phone rang twice before a voice picked up, low and gravelly. "Hello?" "It's me," I said, trying to steady my voice. "I need your help. I found something about Aunt Clara. It's about the missing people. There's something you need to see." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear his thoughts turning. When he spoke again, his voice was tight. "You shouldn't have called me. You have no idea what you're dealing with." I felt my pulse quicken. "What do you mean? What happened to her? Why did she keep those photographs?" He exhaled sharply. "I can't tell you everything, but I can tell you this: your aunt wasn't just keeping photographs. She was documenting something dangerous. Those people on the photos? They were never just missing. They were part of something bigger, something connected. And if you've seen those photos, you're already in deeper than you realize." His words sent a wave of nausea through me. What had she gotten involved in? And what was this something that was connected to the missing people? "You need to get rid of the camera," he said urgently. "Burn the film. Forget about it. I'm telling you this for your own good." But I couldn't. I couldn't just let it go. I can't, I whispered. I need to know what happened. Another long silence. Then, almost as though he had made up his mind, he spoke again, but this time his voice was low, like he was afraid someone would hear. You don't get it. She wasn't just taking photos of people who disappeared. She was taking photos of people who crossed over. And those people don't stay gone. Not forever. The line went dead before I could respond. I sat there, the phone still pressed to my ear, the weight of his words hanging in the air like a suffocating fog. People who crossed over. What did that even mean? And what had my aunt been involved in? There were too many questions, and no answers in sight. But one thing was clear, my life was never going to be the same again. I had no choice now. I had to follow this trail, no matter how dark it got. I had to find the truth. But deep down, I knew that the truth would cost me more than I was ready to pay. The house felt like it was closing in on me. The walls were too tight, the air too still. I paced back and forth, running my hands through my hair, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The phone call from my aunt's old friend echoed in my mind, each word sinking deeper into my thoughts. People who crossed over. What did he mean by that? And why did my aunt have photographs of them? Why had she kept them, hidden them so carefully? I glanced over at the table where the camera sat, silent, ominous. I could almost hear it calling to me, daring me to look through it again, to see the things it had captured, the things it had shown my aunt. But I couldn't. Not yet. My mind kept returning to the photograph of the man from 1995. I had studied his face so many times, but now it was like I was seeing it for the first time, like something in me was finally understanding what it meant. I grabbed the picture, staring at it with fresh eyes. The words on the back, the cryptic message about "she's coming for you, too," had sent a chill through my spine, but now, in the silence of the house, it felt like more than a warning. It felt like a promise. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me from my thoughts. I almost didn't want to answer, but something urged me to. It was a text message from an unknown number. You've seen the photos. You've seen too much. If you want to survive, stop looking. It's already too late. My heart pounded in my chest as I read the message again. A cold sweat broke out across my skin. Whoever had sent this knew what I had seen, knew what was happening. And they were warning me. But warning me from what? What would happen if I kept going? I stared at the message for a long moment, my mind racing. I couldn't just stop now. I couldn't ignore what I had discovered. My aunt's disappearance. The people in the photographs. The warnings. I had to find out more. I reached for my phone again, but my finger hesitated over the screen. I wasn't sure who to trust anymore. But I knew one thing. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. Suddenly, the house felt colder, darker. A low hum filled the air, almost imperceptible, like a sound coming from far away, but so close that it made my skin crawl. It was the same hum I had heard on the night I found the camera, but this time it was stronger, louder. I stepped back, my breath coming out in short gasps. The noise was unsettling, like the air itself was vibrating with some unseen force. I grabbed the camera off the table and looked through the lens again. The lens felt cool to the touch, almost too cold, like it was trying to pull me into it. I focused the camera on the corner of the room, where shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if they were alive, waiting. Nothing. just empty space. But as I looked through the viewfinder, something caught my eye, a small movement in the corner of the frame. I blinked, trying to focus. It was barely noticeable, like a fleeting shape. A figure. I pulled the camera down, my heart skipping a beat. There was nothing there. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen it. The figure was real. It was there. I tried to calm myself, to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I had to get out of the house. I grabbed my jacket, still clutching the camera, and rushed out the door. The night air hit me like a slap to the face, cold and sharp. The hum was gone, but the dread in my chest remained, heavy and unshakable. I walked quickly, almost running, down the street, away from the house, away from whatever it was that was following me. But every step felt wrong, like the ground beneath my feet was shifting. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret, and every rustle of the trees sounded like something was just behind me, waiting to pounce. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. I reached the corner of the block and paused, glancing around. There was nothing out of the ordinary, just the quiet of a small town at night. But then, a flash of movement caught my eye. I whipped my head around, heart racing, but there was nothing there. No one. Just the empty street. I started to walk again, faster now, trying to shake the paranoia that was clouding my thoughts. But then, I heard it. A soft, scraping sound, like something dragging across the ground. It was faint at first, but as I walked, it grew louder. Closer. I turned around, instinctively, but again, I saw nothing. I forced myself to keep moving, pushing my fear aside. But the scraping sound continued, growing louder with every step I took. It was coming from behind me. My eyes flickered to the camera in my hand. Without thinking, I lifted it to my face and looked through the lens. There, in the viewfinder, was the shape. The figure I had seen earlier. It was closer now, standing just a few feet away. I gasped, stumbling backward. But when I looked up, the street was empty. There was nothing there. I lowered the camera, my hands trembling. My mind was playing tricks on me. It had to be. The fear was messing with my head. I took a deep breath and forced myself to keep moving, but the camera felt heavier in my hands now, like it was holding something I couldn't see. Something that was getting closer. I had to know what was happening. I had to understand what was in those photographs. But I was starting to wonder if finding the truth would cost me more than I was willing to pay. Everything went black. When I woke up, I was back at the house. At least, it looked like the house, but everything felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy with an unnatural silence. I tried to move, but my body felt stiff, as if it didn't belong to me anymore. I was lying on the floor, and the shards of the camera's lens were scattered around me. I slowly pushed myself up, my head throbbing as if I had just woken from a long, disturbing dream. But the images from that dream, the figures in the photos, the whispering voice, were still fresh in my mind, too real to be just a dream. I looked around the room, but it was empty. The walls were untouched, but the photographs were gone. The table, the chair, everything had vanished. Only the cold, dark emptiness remained. It was like I had never been here at all. I stood up and tried to steady myself. My hands were trembling, and my thoughts were scattered, racing from one terror to the next. I was trying to find an explanation, something that would make sense of everything that had happened. but nothing made sense anymore. I stumbled to the door and pushed it open, hoping for some kind of escape, some kind of answer. But the world outside was the same, silent, dark, and wrong. The streets were deserted, the houses were empty. It felt like the entire world had been swallowed by a void, leaving only me behind. Then I saw it. In the distance, barely visible through the mist, there was something. A figure. It was standing at the end of the street, staring directly at me, just as it had in the photographs. The same dark shape, obscured by shadows, but this time it wasn't confined to a photo. It was real, and it was waiting. I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey me. I was frozen, staring at the figure as it slowly started to walk toward me. My breath caught in my throat as it took a step, then another, and with each step, the ground beneath it seemed to ripple, the air thickening with an oppressive weight. I couldn't look away. I wanted to, but I couldn't. It was coming closer now, its form becoming clearer. It was taller than any person I had ever seen, its limbs unnaturally long, its face hidden beneath a dark hood. And then, just as it stepped into the dim light, I saw it, the thing that had been hiding beneath the shadow all this time. It had no eyes. Just empty, black sockets that seemed to pull in all the light around them. I felt a surge of terror unlike anything I had ever known. The air felt heavier, the silence deafening, and all I could hear was the faint whisper in my mind, growing louder and louder. "You're already one of us." I tried to scream, but no sound came. My throat was dry, my chest tight with fear. I stumbled backward, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't listen. It was as if I was trapped in some kind of nightmare, unable to wake up. The figure stopped just a few feet away from me. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. I could feel the cold emanating from it, chilling me to the bone. It raised one of its long, thin arms, and I knew what was coming. But instead of reaching out to touch me, it slowly began to raise its hand, pointing directly at me. And then, everything went dark again. I don't know how much time passed. It could have been seconds, or it could have been hours. But when I opened my eyes again, I was lying in my bed, as if nothing had happened. The sun was rising outside my window, casting a soft glow over the room. For a moment, I thought it was all just a nightmare. A twisted, frightening dream. But as I sat up, I saw the camera on my desk, its lens still cracked. And beside it, there was a photograph, one I didn't recognize. I picked it up slowly, my hands shaking. The photograph was of me, standing on the street outside the house, staring into the camera. But my eyes, they weren't mine. They were dark, hollow, empty. And the worst part? I was smiling. But it wasn't my smile. It was the same smile I had seen in the other photographs, the smile of the missing. I dropped the photograph, my heart racing. There was no escaping this. There was no waking up. I had become part of the story now, a piece of the puzzle that could never be put back together. The whispers started again, louder this time, as if they were coming from inside my own mind. "You're one of us now." And I understood. The photographs weren't just capturing images. They were trapping souls, taking them into the world beyond the lens. And now, I was one of them. Forever lost, trapped in the same darkness, waiting for the next person to find me. The last thing I saw before everything faded into blackness was my reflection in the cracked lens of the camera, my eyes, empty and cold, staring back at me. hotel corridor. It was nearly midnight when I first heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound echoing from down the corridor. At first, I thought it was just the usual creaks and groans of an old building settling in the quiet of the night. But as the sound persisted, I started to wonder if there was something more to it. A faint tapping, almost like footsteps, but muffled and slow. I glanced at the clock beside my bed. It was late, too late to be hearing anything from other guests, especially in a hotel that was relatively quiet for the time being. I had checked in a few hours ago, only to find the hotel almost completely empty, with just a handful of people scattered across the various floors. The staff had been polite but distant, offering no small talk as they gave me my room key and directed me to my floor. I had brushed off the strange feeling I got upon entering. Old hotels often gave off a peculiar vibe, the kind that made you wonder what secrets the walls had witnessed over the years. But this was different. I sat up in bed, listening intently. The sound continued. It wasn't a one-off noise like the building shifting. It was something else, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing up and down the hall. The pattern of movement sounded distant, but it was unmistakable. For a moment, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a maintenance worker or another guest who had stayed out late, walking around. But why the slow pace? And why hadn't anyone else reacted? Surely, I wasn't the only one who could hear it. I got out of bed and moved toward the door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I wanted to see who, or what, was causing the noise, but at the same time, a part of me urged caution. Something about this situation felt wrong. The hallway outside my room was dark, save for a few dimly lit emergency lights, casting long, distorted shadows along the walls. The footsteps continued. I opened the door crack, peering out into the corridor. At first, I saw nothing. Just the empty hallway stretching out in both directions. No one in sight. No other rooms open. Just silence, save for the steady, rhythmic steps. But I knew they were there. Whoever, or whatever, was making the sound was just out of view. I hesitated for a moment longer, then stepped into the hallway. The air felt colder than it had been in my room, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The footsteps were closer now. And yet, when I turned the corner to look, the hallway was still empty. I didn't know why, but I felt compelled to follow the sound. Something inside me, a strange mixture of curiosity and fear, pushed me forward. I moved cautiously, my footsteps barely making a sound as I crept down the corridor, the echo of the other steps growing louder and clearer with each passing second. Then, just as I was about to reach the end of the hallway, the noise suddenly stopped. I froze. My heart was pounding in my chest. The silence that followed felt oppressive, like the kind of silence that makes you feel as though you're being watched. I stood there, not daring to move, my ears straining for any hint of a sound. And then, without warning, I heard it again. The footsteps, but closer this time, right behind me. I whipped around, but once again, no one was there. The hallway was as empty as before. My breath caught in my throat, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shadow move at the far end of the corridor, just out of the corner of my eye. But when I looked, there was nothing. I quickly retreated back into my room, shutting the door behind me with a trembling hand. The lock clicked into place, but the unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in that hallway with me. Something that didn't belong. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, exhaustion, or nerves playing tricks on me. After all, it was a quiet hotel, and I was alone on the floor. Maybe it was a pipe or some mechanical issue that had caused the strange noise. But as I lay back in bed, I couldn't help but wonder about the hallway. The air was too cold, the silence too heavy, the shadows too long, and when I finally closed my eyes to sleep, I couldn't shake the sound of footsteps following me in the darkness. The next morning, the strange events of the night before felt like a distant dream. I woke up with the sun filtering through the curtains, the quiet comfort of the room offering me a sense of normalcy. The events of the previous night felt almost absurd in the daylight, as if the mind had played tricks on me, conjuring up shadows and noises where none existed. I rubbed my eyes and stretched, trying to shake off the lingering unease. A glance at the clock told me it was already late in the morning. I had slept through breakfast, but something inside me didn't quite feel right. I wasn't sure what it was, an overwhelming sense of isolation, perhaps, but the thought of leaving my room didn't feel as inviting as it should have. With a sigh, I got dressed and decided to check out the front desk. Maybe I could get a quick coffee and ask about the amenities or the surrounding area. As I walked out of my room, the hallway seemed different in the daylight. The shadows no longer felt as long, and the air didn't carry the same chilling weight it had the night before. Everything looked perfectly ordinary, almost boring. The thick, patterned carpet under my feet muffled my steps, and the wallpaper with its faded floral design looked more nostalgic than eerie. But something about the place still felt off. I made my way to the elevator and pressed the button to go down. It was quiet. Too quiet. When the elevator doors opened, I found myself on the main floor of the hotel. An elegant, though somewhat outdated, lobby greeted me. The receptionist behind the desk looked up at me with a forced smile, the kind of expression you wear when you're supposed to be welcoming, but you'd rather be somewhere else. "Good morning. How can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but not warm. "Hi, I was just wondering," I started, trying to mask the lingering unease I felt. "Is there anyone else staying on my floor?" She raised an eyebrow, her fingers pausing on the keyboard. "On your floor," she repeated, sounding surprised. "Which floor was that, sir?" The fourth floor," I said. The receptionist glanced at the screen before looking up again. "That floor is actually closed to guests at the moment," she replied, her voice flat. I blinked in confusion. Closed? I was just up there last night. The door to the hallway was open, and She cut me off with a polite smile, though her eyes had a hint of something unreadable in them. "Sir, I'm sorry, but that floor hasn't been open for booking for years. Are you sure you were on the fourth floor?" Her response was so calm, so matter-of-fact, that it made the hairs on my neck stand up. I wanted to argue, to explain the footsteps, to tell her about the strange silence of the night. But the words caught in my throat. I tried to rationalize the situation. Perhaps I had been mistaken. Maybe my room had been on the third floor, or maybe I had simply misremembered which elevator I took. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something was wrong. I had checked the room number when I entered room 402, the fourth floor. I could still see the key card in my mind. "Are you sure?" I asked again, almost desperate for a reasonable explanation. The receptionist's smile never wavered. "Yes, sir. The fourth floor has been out of service for quite a while. I can show you the list of available rooms, if you'd like." Something inside me recoiled at the thought of revisiting that floor, even for answers. But I couldn't let it go. Something wasn't adding up. "Actually, do you mind telling me why it's closed?" I asked, my voice steadier now, though there was a growing knot in my stomach. Her eyes flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something, a shadow of discomfort, maybe, or just a flicker of hesitation. But it was gone almost instantly, replaced by that same polite smile. "It's just part of the renovations, sir. Nothing to worry about," she said smoothly. "Would you like to make another booking?" I nodded absently, but her answer didn't satisfy me. Something about her response didn't feel genuine. There was something off about the way she spoke, almost like she knew something I didn't. "Thank you," I muttered, feeling more unsettled than ever. I turned to leave, but paused for a moment. "Could I get a brochure of the history of this place?" I asked, trying to divert my focus. I've always been curious about old hotels like this one. Her smile tightened just slightly, but she didn't hesitate. "Of course, sir. I'll have it ready for you by the time you're back from your walk." With that, I left the lobby, stepping back into the street, the daylight offering me a brief moment of respite. But the more I thought about the night before, the more I couldn't shake the sense that something had gone terribly wrong. The footsteps, the hallway, the locked-off floor. It all pointed to something beyond my understanding. I needed answers. I spent the rest of the day walking around the town, trying to shake off the growing dread that had gripped me. The fresh air didn't help. I was restless, my mind racing with thoughts of that closed-off floor, of the receptionist's calm but unsettling demeanor. The more I tried to convince myself that I had just imagined it all, the more questions formed. What was the real reason that floor was off limits? Why hadn't anyone mentioned it when I checked in? It didn't make sense. And why had I been allowed on that floor at all if it was supposedly closed? I walked along the main street, trying to take in the sights, but everything felt distant, as if I was moving through a fog. The shops, the people, the cars, they all felt so ordinary, yet I couldn't stop thinking about that damned hallway. The strange noises. The silence. It was as if the hotel itself was hiding something. By late afternoon, I found myself standing in front of a small, second-hand bookstore. I didn't know why I had come here, but it felt like I was being pulled inside. The scent of old paper and dust immediately greeted me as I pushed open the door. The shelves were stacked high with novels, history books, and dusty travel guides, their spines faded from age. I wasn't really sure what I was looking for, but I felt compelled to ask the old man behind the counter if he knew anything about the history of the hotel. Perhaps, buried in some forgotten corner, there would be an answer, or at least a clue. "Excuse me," I said, approaching the counter. The man looked up at me from behind his glasses. His face was lined with age, his hair thinning, but his eyes held an unnerving sharpness. "I'm staying at the Northwood Hotel," I began, trying to sound casual. "Do you know anything about its history?" He didn't reply immediately. His gaze lingered on me for a long moment, as if assessing something unspoken. Finally, he nodded slowly. "The Northwood," he said, almost to himself. "A lot of people come here asking about it. Some wish they hadn't." His words sent a chill through me. "What do you mean?" He looked around, as if making sure no one was listening. Then, lowering his voice, he leaned in closer. "There's a reason the hotel isn't as popular as it once was. Some say it's haunted. Others claim it's just bad luck." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "But there's something darker about it, something people prefer to forget." I felt a sudden tightening in my chest. "What do you mean by darker?" The old man hesitated, his fingers drumming lightly on the wooden counter. "You should be careful with your questions," he said cryptically. "The hotel has a past. A history of things being lost. People who disappeared. He glanced toward the back of the shop, his voice barely above a whisper. And then there's the 4th floor. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. The 4th floor? I repeated, my voice catching in my throat. The man nodded, though his expression was unreadable. They say it's cursed. That no one who stays there ever leaves the same. You should leave while you still can. I felt my blood run cold. My mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fit together in terrifying ways. The footsteps, the locked-off floor, the strange behavior of the receptionist, it was all connected. The hotel wasn't just a hotel. It was something else, something older, something that shouldn't have been. Why is it closed? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The old man shook his head slowly. No one knows for sure. But it's been years since anyone has stayed on that floor. It's dangerous. Stay away from it. Trust me. I didn't say anything else. There was nothing more to say. I thanked him stiffly, my mind still reeling from his words. The hotel had a dark history, one that no one wanted to talk about. And yet, somehow, I had walked right into it. The rest of the evening was a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about the old man's warning, about the 4th floor, and about what I had experienced. The footsteps in the hallway, the eerie silence, the fact that no one else was supposed to be staying on my floor, it all pointed to something sinister. Something I couldn't yet fully understand. When I returned to the hotel, the receptionist was gone, replaced by a younger man who seemed completely uninterested in my presence. I asked for a brochure about the hotel's history, and he handed it to me without a word. As I climbed the stairs to my room, I glanced nervously at the elevator. I couldn't help but wonder what had happened to those who stayed on the 4th floor. Had they disappeared, like the old man suggested? Or had they simply been forgotten? I didn't know, but I was beginning to feel as though I would never leave the hotel with the same sense of safety I had once had. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The silence in the hotel was oppressive, and every creak of the building made my heart race. The footsteps, faint at first, began again. I froze, listening, my breath catching in my throat. The sound of someone walking, slow and deliberate, was unmistakable. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. I rushed to the door, not caring about anything except getting away from that sound. But as I opened the door, the hallway was empty. Just the silence. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was still there. The next morning, I woke up feeling drained, as if I hadn't slept at all. The events of the previous night haunted my every thought. I tried to convince myself that I had simply been imagining things, that the footsteps had been the result of too much stress or fatigue. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something I couldn't explain. I went down to the lobby for breakfast, trying to push the fear from my mind. The hotel was quiet, like it always was, but there was a subtle tension in the air, an energy I couldn't shake. The receptionist from the day before was back, her demeanor as cool and professional as before, but this time I couldn't help but watch her closely, searching for any sign of unease. "Good morning," she said with a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Good morning," I replied, trying to sound casual. But I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. "I was wondering if you could tell me more about the history of this hotel." I was asking around, and people seemed to know a lot about its past. Her expression faltered for just a moment before she regained her composure. The hotel has been around for a long time, she said, her tone polite but clipped. But I'm afraid we don't give out much information about its history. Why is that? I pressed, unable to stop myself. She hesitated, as if considering how to answer. There are some things best left in the past, she finally said, her voice colder than before. Some things are better forgotten. I felt a chill run down my spine. There it was again, the same cryptic response I'd gotten from the old man at the bookstore. What was it about this hotel that everyone seemed so determined to keep hidden? Before I could ask more, she quickly changed the subject, ushering me toward the breakfast bar. I took a seat, but I couldn't focus on the food. My mind was racing. There had to be a reason why this hotel was so full of secrets. Why it felt as though it was trying to keep me from finding the truth. I finished breakfast quickly and decided to take a walk around the hotel. I couldn't stay in that room for another second. The place felt suffocating, like the walls themselves were closing in. I wandered through the corridors, the dim lighting casting long shadows across the faded carpet. My footsteps echoed off the walls, and for a moment it felt as though the hotel itself was holding its breath. I reached the end of the hall, where the staircase led to the upper floors. The second floor. The third floor. And then, there it was. The door to the fourth floor. I hadn't planned on coming up here, but now, standing at the foot of the stairs, I felt an irresistible pull. Every inch of my being screamed at me to turn around, to walk away, but curiosity, no, desperation, was too strong. Something inside me told me that I had to know. I had to uncover what had been hidden for so long. I hesitated for a moment, but then I walked up the stairs, my hand gripping the railing so tightly my knuckles turned white. The closer I got to the door at the top, the more the air seemed to grow heavy, as if the very atmosphere had changed. It wasn't just the silence, it was the absence of sound, the sense that something had been erased, wiped away. I reached the top of the stairs and stood in front of the door, my breath shallow. The brass doorknob was cold to the touch. I turned it slowly, the click of the lock echoing like a shot in the stillness. The door opened with a creak, and I stepped into the hallway. The fourth floor was dark. The lights were dim, and the air smelled stale, as though no one had been here in years. The wallpaper was peeling in places, the floors cracked and chipped. But what struck me most was the silence. There was no sound at all. No distant voices. No hum of the building. It was as if the world outside had simply ceased to exist. I stepped forward, my shoes echoing on the worn floors, and felt my pulse quicken. I couldn't explain why, but every part of me was screaming to leave. But I couldn't stop now. I had to see it. I had to understand what was happening. The hallway stretched on ahead of me, lined with closed doors, their surfaces worn and yellowed with age. At the far end, I saw a faint flicker of light beneath one of the doors. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure why, but I felt drawn to it. I walked slowly toward it, my breath shallow. As I neared the door, I could hear something, soft whispers, like voices murmuring just beyond my reach. My skin prickled with dread, but I couldn't stop myself. I reached for the door, my hand trembling. And then, just as I was about to turn the knob, I heard it. A loud, unmistakable footstep from behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but the hallway was empty. Empty except for me. The footsteps stopped. My breath caught in my throat as I stood frozen, staring down the empty corridor. And then, slowly, almost reluctantly, I turned back to the door with the flickering light. But it was gone. The light was out. The door was closed, and all that remained was darkness. I stood there, frozen. My mind struggled to comprehend what was happening, but I couldn't make sense of any of it. The light had been there a moment ago, and now it was gone. Just darkness, like the entire floor was swallowing itself whole. I took a cautious step forward, my eyes darting back and forth, searching for any sign of movement. The air felt colder here, the silence more oppressive. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, and a chill ran down my spine. This isn't real, I thought. It can't be. It must be exhaustion, or maybe the hotel's electrical system playing tricks on me. But my feet didn't obey my mind's instructions to turn back. Instead, they carried me forward into the darkness. The creaking of the floorboards echoed in the void, growing louder with each step, as though the building itself was responding to my presence. The whispers from before, those faint murmurs, were growing again, louder now, as though the voices were gathering, surrounding me. My pulse quickened. Who's there? I wanted to shout, but the words caught in my throat. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to flee, but my legs refused to listen. I was trapped by something beyond my understanding, something that wanted me to keep going. I reached the door at the end of the hall, the one with the light that had vanished. I couldn't even remember what had drawn me to it in the first place, but now it felt as though it was the only thing that mattered. My hand grasped the cold, rusted doorknob, and I twisted it. The door creaked open, slowly, revealing a room that was almost identical to the others I had seen. Faded wallpaper, dust collecting in the corners, a single window letting in pale light from outside. But this room felt different. There was something in the air, something thick, like the weight of years pressing down on me. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. My eyes scanned the room, but the unease in my chest was growing, suffocating. In the far corner, against the wall, was a figure. I blinked hard, trying to make sense of it, but the image before me remained unchanged. A woman, standing with her back to me, facing the corner. She was dressed in a faded white gown, her hair long and unkempt, hanging like a curtain around her face. Her body was unnaturally still, and yet I could feel her presence in every inch of the room. This isn't real, I thought again, but the words felt hollow now. I took a hesitant step forward, but my foot didn't meet the ground in the way it should have. It was like the floor dropped away beneath me, my body jerking to a halt as if I had walked into an invisible barrier. The woman didn't move. She just stood there, silent and unmoving, as though she was waiting for something or someone. I forced myself to step back, away from the door, but my movement was sluggish, like the very air around me was thickening, holding me in place. This place is wrong, I thought, my head spinning. None of this makes sense. What is this place? I looked back at the woman. Her face, obscured by her hair, was as still and lifeless as the rest of her. But I felt something deep within me that told me she was aware of me, that she knew I was there. My body trembled. I had to leave. I had to get out of there. But the door was gone. The hallway outside had vanished, leaving nothing but the empty room and the woman standing in the corner. I could feel my heart thundering in my chest. My breaths were shallow, my mind racing to find a way out, a way to make sense of the nightmare that had engulfed me. And then I heard it. The footsteps. They were back. The sound was unmistakable, growing louder and louder as if someone was walking toward me down the long hallway. But there was no hallway. There was nothing beyond the walls of this room. The woman's head slowly turned. Her hair parted, revealing pale, eyes that locked onto mine with a cold intensity that sent a wave of ice through my veins. Her mouth opened, and she whispered something, her voice barely audible over the sound of my own rapid breathing. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the weight of them pressing down on me as if they were meant for me alone. Leave. The words seemed to echo in my mind, though her lips never moved. Leave now. But I couldn't move. The paralysis gripped me, leaving me immobile, trapped in the room with the woman and the footsteps that were growing louder, closer, and closer. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to run, but my legs refused to obey. The footsteps reached the door. The woman smiled, an unsettling, twisted smile that didn't belong on a human face. It was a smile that belonged to something else, something ancient, something evil. And then, the door slammed shut, plunging me into darkness. The last thing I heard was the sound of footsteps, growing fainter and fainter, as if they were walking away from me, but they never stopped. They never stopped. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.